Thank you. Before we get started, I can't resist another quiz. Before I mention the Buffalo Soldiers, what prominent figure in U.S. society holds up the Buffalo Soldiers as his heroes and has a statue of them on his desk? Very good. and it's very, very appropriate for someone who, since Vietnam to the present, has been a war criminal and someone who's committed monstrous crimes against humanity. But let's get into things even deeper. As I said, I'm going to talk about how all these things flow from the very nature of the system and why it cannot be reformed. It must be done in and done away with. We need a revolution, the most radical revolution in the history of humanity. If you want to eliminate a problem or an evil, you must get to the root of it. If you want to eliminate the oppression and miserable conditions of the masses of people in the world today, you have to dig down to the underlying foundation, the ground in which this oppression and misery is rooted, and which continually gives rise to this oppression and suffering. You cannot get rid of a poisonous plant and create something healthy in its place just by pulling up the top of the plant. You have to pull it up from the roots and then grow something completely different and change the soil too. That is what a radical solution is. Radical means having to do with the root. And this is why a real revolution is needed, and this is what it's all about. Now, fundamental things about the world are hidden from us. Fundamental refers to the foundation, like the foundation of a house or another building, the thing that everything rests on. So what is the fundamental thing about how the world works that is hidden from us? The fundamental thing that goes on in the world every day that enables human beings to live and have a society is the exchange of labor among people. Now, like I said, this is not at all obvious. If there were only 6 people in the entire world, or we had 6 people just by themselves living together, this would be more obvious, because then the 6 of them would get together and they'd say, okay, what are you going to do? Maybe you're going to go out and hunt for food. Maybe you're going to go out and find materials to build a house. Maybe you two are going to work on constructing the house. And you would see how everybody's labor, in one form or another, contributed to people being able to survive and interact with each other in a society. But we don't have 6 people in the world. We have 6 billion. And they live not just in one little place, but all over the globe. But still, the same fundamental thing is going on. If you go to work, you put in a certain amount of work. You get back a certain amount of money in exchange for that work. You go buy certain products at the store or whatever, and then you take them to your house and use them, and you exchange things in that kind of a way. This goes on in such an everyday way that we don't even stop and think about it. But you are actually exchanging things indirectly through all these different stages with people all over the various parts of the globe. Think about it this way. Don't do it right now. But when you go home, check out your clothes. Look at the labels on them. Don't just look at where it says what company brand is on the clothes. But look where it says where these clothes or other things you have were made. In Nicaragua, in Honduras, in Haiti, in Pakistan, in Egypt, all over the world. We are exchanging things, and ultimately and fundamentally we're exchanging labor. People in those countries are putting in a certain amount of labor. And we're putting in a certain amount, and that's being exchanged through the form of the way in which we buy things with money. But it's not very obvious because partly they want to keep it hidden from us. And the other reason is there are things that get in the way of our seeing that very clearly. First is the fact that there are all these intermediate steps. We're not the 6 people directly exchanging labor with each other. We're exchanging money, getting something. The remote character of where it came from is not obvious unless you do go read those labels, for example. So that's kind of one thing that keeps it hidden from us, is that here's somebody working in a sweatshop in Pakistan making the shirt that you wear, and you're over here putting in a certain amount of work so that you get the money to be able to go to buy that shirt when it gets to a store that you go to. You're exchanging the labor you put in for the labor they put in to make that shirt, but it goes through so many stages in between that you don't see that. But the other thing that gets in the way, and today the more significant thing, is that each of these steps, someone steps in and says, wait a minute, that's mine, I own it, I'm going to sell it. Not you who made it, me who made you make it. That someone is the capitalist. That's the system we live under. We don't work and exchange our labor directly, or we don't even exchange the products of what we produce with our labor directly. Some capitalist takes it at each stage, says this is mine, and sells it to someone else. And down the line it goes, each time going through another capitalist. But this is what's underlying all that. As I said, go look again at your clothes. Think of the small children who were working 12 and 14 hours a day, making those clothes for pennies an hour if they get that. See if you can see the tears of the children and their blood and bones that go into making those things. See if you can hear the muffled cry and the moans of those children as they're forced to work under these conditions in order to try to live. So what is this wonderful system under which all this takes place? What is capital, and what is capitalism as a system? Capital is a relation of domination, of exploitation, and capitalism is a system based on exploitation. Sometimes people think of capital as money. You heard him talk on the financial channel. Oh, he has so much capital, meaning so much money to invest. And money is one form that capital takes. But that is not the heart and not the essence of it. In a deeper sense, money is only the outward expression of capital. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, I've talked a little bit about the exchange of labor between people, the muffled cries and moans of the children who make not just the clothes, but many of the other things we use. Or let's ask another question. The stock market with its clanging bell we hear about all the time. What are they trading on the stock market? Where does the wealth come from that they're trading in when they buy shares and stocks in different companies and bonds? They're trading in human flesh. They're trading in human suffering. They're trading in what's drained out of those children and out of other people, with their bones literally broken and their skin literally going into the things that are produced. That's where that wealth is created before the capitalist takes it and says it's mine. That's what they're trading in on the stock market. They're trading in exploitation and degradation of people all over the world, including tens of millions or hundreds of millions of children. Another way to get at this money is the outward expression. Look at your money. Who's on it? Mostly dead presidents and slave owners. But are they the ones that created the wealth either back in slavery days or today? Of course not. So what should be on the money to really express the actual relation of things? Who should really be on the money? The little children, the slaves, and others who have been enslaved and exploited and degraded in this way. That should be on the money to tell us where the wealth really came from. And along with that, when we get to it, we'll put people who have led slave rebellions and uprisings and revolutions against this system on the money, as long as we have to use money. Capital is not machinery either. Sometimes you hear people say they got so much capital, got so many machines in the factory or the workshop or whatever. Machinery, after all, is made by people, through the labor of people, like everything else, like those clothes. Somebody made those machines. They didn't appear magically out of somewhere. So once again, when you look at a machine, any kind of machine, including a car or a computer or a CD player or anything, think of the fact that this machine is just the product, the physical embodiment of the labor of the people who made it. Once again, use your imagination and look for all the people in many parts of the world with their skin and their blood, their bones and their suffering that have gone into making all those machines. At the same time, machines are not necessarily capital. Machines are just machines. Whether they are capital or not depends on whether or not they are made under the capitalist system. Under another system, the system of communism, Machinery would be made in radically different conditions, for radically different ends, and would belong to the people, not some capitalists who step in to expropriate them, to take them as their own at each stage of the process. Capital is a relationship in which one person or a group or class of people owns and controls the means to live and the means to create wealth, and thereby forces others to work for them in exchange for a wage. Capital is the control over this labor of others, and it is this, making others work for you, that creates the wealth that the capitalists get. Capitalism is a system in which everything that is produced and exchanged among people is a commodity, and this includes people's labor power, that is, their ability to work. That too is a commodity. It is bought and sold under this system, the capitalist system. And when your labor power is bought and you are put to work, the capitalist who buys your labor power controls you and what you do while you were working for him. They'll even have his slave drivers in a modern form tell you how long you can go to the bathroom or whether you can go to the bathroom. And really, the capitalist class as a whole controls your very life, has the power of life and death over you, because they determine whether or not you can even have a job. And they control you if they give you a job, quote unquote. Capitalism then is a form of modern day slavery. It is wage slavery. That's why I know, at least when I was coming up, people used to regularly refer to a job as a slave. Yeah, I got me a slave, I got to go off and work. But you weren't literally owned. You just produced the wealth, and then you could be fired. But let's back up a second and dig down further into the foundation of this. What is a commodity? You hear that word a lot. What is a commodity? Well, let's take an ugly example to start out with. If a woman makes love with a man because she feels like it and because they care about each other, that can be a beautiful thing. That can be an act, an expression of love, an intimacy between two people who care about each other. But let's take a situation that happens all too often. You're in a housing project or somewhere and you've got to get to work. Or your kids are sick and you've got to get them to the hospital, and you go running out to get your car to drive your kids to the hospital to get to work, and your car doesn't work. And you know some guy down the street who knows how to work on cars, and you go to him and you say, would you please help me get my car going? And he's not thinking the way he should be, and he says, all right, I'll help you, but you got to give me a little something, something. Now you know this happens. And this is turning what should be a beautiful thing, an act of intimacy between people, into an ugly thing, into a form of a commodity, into which two things are being exchanged for each other. He's helping you with your car, but you got to give him some sex that you may not at all want to give him. Let's take a more commonplace example of commodities. Let's say you grow tomatoes in your backyard. And you eat them yourself, you put them in salad, you give them to your kids, you invite your friends over, and you all eat them. Well, that's not a commodity. Why not? Because the person who's making them, you, is just using them directly. You're not exchanging them with anybody for anything else. If you invite your friends over, if you're a good friend, you don't say, give me some money for these tomatoes, you just give them some tomatoes. So a commodity then is not something that's produced to be used directly by the people who produce it. It's something that's produced to be exchanged either directly or through money, is the more common way these days, for another something, another commodity. And one of the things about this is, because it's not made to be directly used but to be exchanged, is you get the separation of usability of this thing from its sellability. And sellability rules over usability. Now, what am I talking about? Let's say you're really good at making chocolate chip cookies. You make chocolate chip cookies, everybody loves them. Your kids love them, all your friends love them. You make them and eat them all the time, maybe more than you should. But then one day, one of your friends trying to do you a favor says, man, these chocolate chip cookies are really good. You ought to sell these. You could make a lot of money. You could be famous like Famous Amos. So you go along with it, you think, well, yeah, let me try it. So you make some chocolate chip cookies and you put up a stand, and sure enough, people come over and buy from them and they love your chocolate chip cookies. But then you're out. So what are you going to do? If you're going to keep going with this, you got to go back and buy some more flour, and you got to go back and buy some more butter, and some more eggs, and some more walnuts, and some more chocolate chips, some more sugar. And then you start making more chocolate chip cookies, but then you run into something. When you're trying to sell these, you run into all these big companies. They already got a famous Amos out there, and they got other people making these on a massive scale in factories and everything. So you can't make enough to compete with that and to sell them cheaply enough. So then you start saying, well, maybe I better hire somebody to help me make these cookies. Or you get an idea, maybe I'll get my kids to help me. So you get your kids, you start making them, but you're still up against these big companies out there making these cookies. And after a little while, your kids say, we're tired of this, can we have something to eat? And you say, kids, sellability, not usability, sellability. And they look at you and they say, huh? And you say, you're eating up the product. Well, see, this is what it means to get caught up in commodity production and exchange, and you can see what it starts leading to. You either get bigger or you get eaten up. You better go back to just enjoying your own chocolate chip cookies. Producing and exchanging things as commodities leads to anarchy in production and exchange. By anarchy here, I mean a lot of uncertainty, disorder, and chaos, where it is very difficult to know in advance or to predict or to calculate accurately what is going to happen. For example, how much of your product you're going to be able to sell in competition with other people out there. Now, the only way to get your money back is by selling your commodities in this uncertain situation. A situation where many different people are bringing commodities into the market. A situation that is always changing and always open to big changes. A situation in which even big-time operators can get taken down and swallowed up by even bigger and more powerful and more ruthless ones. Again, capitalism makes commodity production and exchange the general way in which things are produced and exchanged in society. It spreads the production and exchange of things as commodities throughout society and throughout the world. And as I said, very importantly, it turns labor power, that is the ability to work itself, also into a commodity. And this is very important because once the capitalist money, the owners of these big companies and so on, once their money is invested as capital for production, that is, once they've bought machinery, raw materials, let's say cotton to be turned into cotton clothes, and so on, and once they've bought people's labor to work and pay them a wage for that, once they've done all that, once they've invested in that way, they have lost that money. It's gone. It's now disappeared into and become embodied in the machinery, the raw materials, and the wages. So they're in a desperate situation themselves. The only way the capitalists can get back that money, plus end up with more capital in the form of more money or profit, the only way he can do that is to exploit the people working for him, force them to produce more wealth than all the money the capitalists invested in the first place. And then the capitalist must sell these products in order to realize his profit. And once again, because of the anarchy of capitalist commodity production and exchange, every capitalist is in this situation, no matter how big they are. They're competing with all the other capitalists doing the same thing all over the country and even all over the world, facing the same compulsion, the same supreme commandment: expand or die, beat out your competitors, accumulate, that is, gather and increase more wealth than you started out with, or go under. Now, monopoly, I'm going to have something to say about monopoly in a minute. This is a situation where one or a few gigantic companies or corporations controls whole industries and whole parts of the economy in large parts of the world. But this monopoly, when it develops, does not change this whole situation. It does not eliminate this drive and this competition. What it does is raise it to a whole other level and spreads it even more fully and forcefully throughout society and throughout the world. And I'm going to come back to this point in a little while. So you can get a sense that this is a vicious cycle that everybody is trapped in so long as we live in a society and a world dominated by capitalism. Even the capitalists themselves are bound by these laws of commodity production and capitalist accumulation. But where they succeed, they gain and benefit from this, while the people they exploit and society as a whole suffers in 1,000 ways from it. For example, under capitalism, Many things that millions of people need, such as decent housing, do not get produced, or do not get produced at prices that can be afforded by those who really need them, all for one reason. What counts to the capitalist is not human need, but what they call demand, measured in money terms. That is, how much money can be gained from producing and selling something. Every capitalist enterprise is in the business of making profit, and they will shift from making one kind of product to another, from making in one part of the country or one part of the world to another, in the restless, endless search for the most profit. They are not in the business of making this or that thing that is useful. They are not in the business of doing that. They are in the business of exploiting those they employ and beating out other capitalists in this process. And to them, the people they hire and fire, the people they never hire in the first place, the people who buy their products, and the people who are too poor to buy them. To the capitalists, everyone counts and can only count as a business calculation, if they count you at all. Now, sometimes you see these fools get up, like these ranchers and all this kind of shit. And, imagine W down there in his ranch, and they say things like, "I'm a self-made man. Nobody gave me anything. I did it all myself. I'm a self-made man." Yeah, you're a self-made man. All the clothes you're wearing, everything you're using is made by other people. The food you eat was picked by other people. The machinery you're driving around, the rifle you own was made by other people. Everything you have and use made by other people. And right now you're exploiting Mexican immigrants on your ranch. And you're sitting on land that was stolen from the native peoples in the first place, but you're a self-made man. That's not what happens under capitalism. Today, one of the main features of the world is what we call the great lopsidedness in the world. That is, the great unevenness, the great gap between the situation for a handful of powerful and wealthy countries on the one hand, and on the other hand, the situation for the great majority of countries and the great majority of humanity throughout the world. To get a sense of this lopsidedness, consider the fact that in the United States today, there are over 1 million millionaires, while nearly half the people in the world are trying to survive on $2 a day. And the U.S., with 5% of the world's population, uses 35% of the world's resources. In the world today, the living standards and poverty levels of the masses of people, hundreds of millions of people in Latin America, are worse than they were 30 years ago. And their nutritional situation is worse than it was more than 500 years ago before the conquistadores came. Now, everybody's heard about Colombian drug lords down there in South America, all the growing of coca and the making of cocaine. But what they don't tell you about is, remember Juan Valdez? They used to have these ads for the coffee that came out of Colombia. Of course, it was all owned by big American corporations anyway, but they used to have this character, Juan Valdez. It was supposed to be another self-made man who made his own coffee and then brought it on his mule to, in the saddlebags to the market. Well, the fact is there weren't really Juan Valdez's like that, but there were people in Colombia, small farmers who grew coffee. But what happened is that the decline of coffee production in Colombia came about because of the imperialist stranglehold on the world economy and the world market, very similar to what happened to the Mexican coffee growers that I spoke of just a little while ago. They don't tell you that when they talk about how these peasants in Colombia are growing coca and how it's being turned into cocaine. They don't tell you that people tried to go other things, but the world market and its domination by these big countries and big corporations ruined them and left them with no other way to try to find a living. Along the same lines, the movie Life and Debt, which you can buy or rent in a video store, shows in a very dramatic way how globalization, as they call it, has ruined the agriculture and any kind of self-sufficient economy in Jamaica, and has condemned the people of Jamaica to ever greater poverty. One of the examples that's very graphic in that movie is they show what happened to the Jamaican dairy industry and the dairy farmers and the people who produce the milk from the dairy farms. What happened was that at a certain point, the U.S. government subsidizes the dairy farmers in the U.S. and the dairy industry in the U.S. That is, they pay them money to produce milk. Because the government is in this way what they call underwriting the cost, paying the cost of producing this, they can then sell that milk much more cheaply. So that what happened in Jamaica, as shown in this film, is that the powdered milk coming from the dairy industry in the U.S. and exported to Jamaica, because the U.S. government supported the farmers in doing this, paid them to do this, it was able to be sold more cheaply than the price that the Jamaican dairy farmers and dairy industry could produce and sell milk without going bankrupt. So the effect of this was it ruined the dairy industry and the dairy farmers in Jamaica. And then they pointed out what will start happening now is now that the U.S. dairy industry and farming, which is mainly big corporations or controlled by big corporations, now that they have control of the market in Jamaica, they'll start raising the price because there's no local farmers and local dairy industry to compete with them. So what happens to these dairy farmers and the families that depended on them? Sometimes you hear people talk about all those criminals down there in Jamaica and how they bring crime and drugs to the U.S. When you hear about this, think about where this comes from and how this came about. How people in Jamaica were cast into conditions where for many, crime was one of a few ways left to them to try to survive and make it in this dog-eat-dog world. And the same kind of thing has happened in Haiti and in countries all over the world. Here is a very sharp and important example of the lopsidedness in the world and what is being done about it. Many people from the U.S. go to Nepal to try to climb the highest mountain in the world, Mount Everest, or generally to trek through the mountains in that country. At the same time, the people of Nepal are among the very poorest in the world and are bitterly oppressed. Let's talk, for example, about what life has been like for centuries for women in Nepal. There was an article about this in our paper, the RW, not too long ago. A letter actually from a Nepalese woman. It talked about the conditions of the women there. They don't even get to choose their husbands. They have no right to own property. Their parents marry them off in arranged marriages when they're very young, if they live that long. Because it's a common practice in Nepal, because women are considered so much more worthless than men, or worth so much less. It's a common practice to take the young girl babies and bash their heads in and kill them because they're considered a burden on their parents, on their family. But if you somehow survive that and you're a young woman, you're sold off essentially. You're traded in an arranged marriage, married to some man who's your absolute master. You can't even eat until he's eaten and all the rest of the family is eaten. You have to get up early in the morning and go searching throughout the countryside and up and down the mountains for whatever firewood you can find to bring it back to heat water so that and you have to go hunt for the water too and bring that back so you can then make food, and you can't even eat, like I said, until everybody else has eaten. And because of the impoverished conditions and their miserable life, many women from Nepal have been driven out of the country, sold or tricked into prostitution in India, where a young Nepalese girl is considered a prize. This is what life is like for the women, and it's not much better for the men. Incredible poverty and grinding oppression. Leo Nesto has written a beautiful series in our newspaper called Dispatches, which talks about these conditions and shows beautiful photographs. So beautiful photographs of the Nepalese people showing their conditions and describing their conditions, but also showing miraculous things, showing women in the People's Army in Nepal, who are not only fighters, but leaders in the revolutionary struggle there. Imagine what that represents if you think about the conditions, what they've been for generations and centuries for the women in Nepal. What does it mean that in today's world in Nepal, women are playing a leading role? They're not just breaking out of these confines where they can't choose their own husband. Now they can in the areas that have been liberated by the revolutionary struggle. They don't just have the right to own property for the first time in these new situations, but they're actually playing a leading role. They're actually picking up guns and becoming part of the People's Army and even becoming leaders and commanders and leaders of the revolutionary struggle overall. Now, for many years, for middle-class people in a country like the U.S., and especially the hikers, hippies, and those into New Age things, Nepal has been seen as a land of mountains, mystery, and mysticism. Hey, man. Like, let's go to Nepal, man, and climb some peaks and get up in the rare air and get into an Eastern kind of thing, man. But with the leadership of the Maoists there, the Communist Party of Nepal Maoists, all this is changing. What Nepal is known for now, above all, what just about everyone who talks about Nepal talks about now, is the Maoist revolution there. As I've touched on, and as Lee Onesto's beautiful series brings out much more fully, the masses of people in Nepal are rising up to bring about a complete change through a revolutionary struggle, a revolutionary people's war, which now controls most of the countryside. And as much as the imperialists and reactionaries hate it, it is approaching the threshold of winning power throughout the country at the same time as it faces great new challenges. And I should say, just to make this clear, that our comrades there of the Communist Party of Nepal Maoists have made clear that they do not regard the climbers and trekkers as enemies. They have welcomed them and encouraged them to learn about and support the People's War and the revolutionary transformation of Nepal, through which the people there are coming alive and becoming masters of their own destiny. Why is there such lopsidedness in the world? Capitalism today is imperialism, the highest and final stage of capitalism. The word imperialism comes from the same root word as empire. Basically, it refers to having an empire, dominating and exploiting whole countries and whole peoples. Imperialism is actually a word that gets used in different ways sometimes. But it is important to understand what imperialism is in a scientific way. And I don't get scared by the word scientific. Scientific just means understanding its main, most important features and what defines how it works. That's what science does with things. Imperialism means the domination of monopolies. That is, big banks and other financial institutions and large corporations, their domination in the capitalist economy. Mono means one. So the word monotonous, for example, means one tone. It means if I were just to talk like this all the time, I would be talking in a monotone. Oh, the N wasn't a monotone, but that's what it means to be monotonous. You can see why monotonous also means boring. You can see why that's boring. There used to be a doo-wop singing group back in the day called the Monotones. Did this song called The Book of Love. I never understood why they called themselves the monotone, because it meant only one tone. They had this song, I wonder, wonder who wrote the Book of Love. If they were to do a monotone, it'd be, I wonder, wonder who wrote the Book of Love. Anyway, nobody said we can't have fun while we're doing this. So mono means mono means one. And monopoly just means there's just one pole, just one or a few of something controlling and dominating a whole industry or a whole economy. A few or one or a few big companies dominating whole parts of the economy or whole economies. In the U.S., for example, you can see examples of monopolies everywhere. Think of TV, radio stations. Think of Clear Channel owning all those radio stations. Think of the few cable companies that there are. But not just in communications. Car companies. How many car companies are there? Think about soda. How many soda companies are there? Fast food. How many fast food companies are there? How many mom and pop stores are left? They've all been driven out by McDonald's, Wendy's, and Burger King. And you can go right down the line. Every part of the economy is dominated by one or a few gigantic companies. That's monopoly. That's one of the main features of capitalism when it reaches the stage of monopoly capitalism or imperialism, because it spreads this all over the world. But besides the domination of the economy by monopolies, imperialism means the joining together of capitalists in big international or what are sometimes called multinational companies, corporations, or combinations of gigantic combinations of corporations, which monopolize large part of the country, large parts of the economy of countries all over the world. And at the same time, there continues to be rivalry between monopolies within countries and all over the world, because the laws of capitalism and capitalist commodity production and exchange, the law of expand or die, beat out the other one or go under, that law is still operating. Imperialism also means exporting capital to countries all over the world. By that I mean investing and directly exploiting the people in those countries and making loans to local companies and local governments, profiting from the interest on the loans and gaining more control that way over the economies of those countries. Imperialism means the domination of the nations that are less capitalistically developed, what today is generally called the Third World, and the super exploitation of the working people there. That is, exploitation even beyond what occurs in the capitalist countries themselves. And bound up with all this, imperialism means war. War against rival imperialist states like World War I and World War II, and war against the oppressed peoples and nations of the Third World, and especially against their revolutionary struggles to end domination by imperialism, like the Vietnam War. Or even we had the situation of the recent wars against Iraq, where Saddam Hussein and his government were not at all revolutionary, and were even trying to keep on making deals with the imperialists, but were at the same time trying to get better terms and trying to resist some of the more extreme forms of domination that the U.S. government was insisting on. Now, sometimes you take people like Bill Gates or the founders of Apple Computers, and you'll hear them say things like, well, we took the initiative, we took the risk to come up with something new, so why shouldn't we get the benefits? But a deeper question is, when we think about these Apple computer guys sitting in their garage like nerds tinkering around with things in the 70s, why and how were they in a position to do that? What is the other side of this picture that's blotted out? Why were they, at age 20, let's say, able to spend that time doing that, while someone else on the other side of the world at age 6 was working 12 hours a day, 7 days a week, producing wealth that they were floating on, so to speak? Because all this wealth is underlying. It's like they're sitting in a big swimming pool that's filled up with the labor of children and others all over the world. They're floating on top of it with the leisure time to get up out of the swimming pool and go to their garage and tinker around and come up with some innovation. So when you hear them say this, once again, we have to look at the other side of the picture that's blotted out, and we have to ask, where does the wealth come from that provides the foundation on which they're able to do this? And why do we have a world in which they are able to do that, while millions and hundreds of millions of children from the time they're much younger have no prospect of ever being able to do that, or even ever being able to have any playtime? Capitalism, especially now that it has reached the stage of imperialism, controls, dominates, manipulates, and mangles the lives of people all over the world. Many times you hear these imperialists and their mouthpieces say things like this: well, you say we're exploiting people, but without us there'd be no jobs. They come out with, especially when it comes to light, that they are paying people something like a few cents an hour in countries all over the Third World. No. The truth is that without these imperialists, there would still be people capable of working, people capable of planning and running an economy. There would still be natural resources and potential wealth for the people in those countries when they take control over their societies and remake them in a radical way through revolution. But then, what there would be is no capital, no capitalism, no imperialism exploiting and robbing the people and plundering their countries. And the masses of people everywhere in the world would be much better off. You cannot make this system into something else than what it is. So long as it rules, so long as it is in effect, everything that it does, all the ways it makes people suffer all over the world will continue and only get worse. Because that's the only way this system can operate. The foundation of every society is its economic system, the way in which people organize themselves or are organized under the command of others to produce and distribute the things that people use in everyday life. Without this, society could not exist and human life would stop. From this economic foundation flows the relations among people in the society, the politics, and the art and culture, and the way of thinking that is dominant in that society. Let's take a few examples. Look at slavery. Now, the slave owners in the South in the U.S., they sought to model themselves after the aristocracy, the feudal rulers of Middle Ages Europe. They loved to sit on their verandas, sipping their mint juleps, not doing anything useful, while other people cracked the whip to make people work for them. You've seen that movie, Gone with the Wind. But what was the other side of the picture? The slaves out in the field, having the whip cracked over them, producing the wealth that enabled these slave owners to sit on the verandas and sip mint julep. And the slave culture was very different, of course, than the culture of the slave owners. They didn't model themselves after the feudal aristocracy in Dark Ages Europe. The culture they came up with arose out of their conditions. They developed slave songs and stories and other ways of responding to the conditions they're in and trying to create a life of the mind, a culture that related to that, and also that pointed a way out of it. What was the old song? Follow the Drinking Gourd, for example, was a song which referred to the constellations in the sky and to the North Star that you could follow to get to the north if you escaped from slavery. When we got past slavery, for example, in the South and got sharecropping and the Jim Crow system that I referred to, of course the culture of the aristocracy there, the culture of the plantation owners, was also very different than the culture of the slaves. Of the people who were working on the plantations who were no longer slaves, but now were sharecroppers. Out of those kind of conditions, we got things like the blues. We got songs that were directly related to the condition of people, sometimes complaints about how the boll weevil was destroying the cotton. Because the sharecroppers in the South lived in a situation where the man owned these big plantations and basically allowed them to use the land to grow crops and charged them for everything that they had. All the machinery or animals or tools they used to grow crops, and also all the food they ate and the clothes. They had to buy it from the man's store. And at the end of the year, there'd be a settling of accounts. And the sharecroppers, if they didn't produce enough, they'd just go deeper in debt to the man. And of course, they were always getting cheated anyway. Even if they did produce enough to try to get something back at the end of the year, the scales would be messed with, and the thing they put on the scale wouldn't weigh as much as it should. So they got cheated. And they developed a culture out of this. That's why you had songs about the boll weevil and the blues relating to the conditions of the rural South, because that's what people were living in. And today we have capitalism where everything's a commodity. No romance without finance. What is that but an expression of commodity relations that people are getting caught up in? All this stuff that you see reflected in the culture that's promoted reflects commodity relations even among people. Sex is a commodity. Women is a commodity. Everything is a commodity. And the culture that people have produced who live in these urban conditions is not a culture coming out of the rural South by and large, but it's a culture that reflects people's conditions in an urban situation. Different problems. You don't get songs about the KKK as much as you get once in a while, once in a great while, fuck the police. But we get all too much I'm a pimp and gangster rap. Why? Because the people aren't capable of producing anything better? Of course not. But when they do produce something better, it doesn't get promoted by the big monopolies who once again control all these industries. They want these images going out. Not only is this making money for them, they want these images going out. This is what these people in these inner cities are all about. Hoes and pimps and all the rest of it. So this is what you should think of them. That's why someone like Public Enemy, or before that someone like Melly Mel, had to struggle in the realm of hip-hop. And all this other stuff got promoted when the company stepped in. First they tried to kill all this rap music. Then they said, okay, if we can't kill it, there's a lot of money to be made, plus we can get the message out we want. And this reflects the commodity relations, and it reflects the culture that grows out of this under capitalist society today. And all these different things reflect different economic foundations: slavery or the sharecropping system, or now capitalism and urban society, and ways of life based on these foundations. In the world today, with how technology and knowledge have been developed, and with the situation of billions of people on the planet, there are only two kinds of ways that societies and their economic foundations can be organized. Only two kinds of systems are possible: the capitalist imperialist system, with all the suffering and horrors it brings about, and cannot help bringing about for the great majority of humanity. It's either that or a whole other kind of system based on radically different principles and radically different ways of doing things. Now, I'll have much more to say about this radically different system of socialism and communism as this talk goes on. But right now, the point I want to emphasize is this: unless and until we break through and consciously revolutionize society and bring into being that radically different system worldwide, unless and until we do that, every attempt to change things will get dragged down by the pull of necessity, by the need to keep society running somehow. And without a revolution that radically changes things from bottom to top, a revolution that makes possible a whole different way of organizing and running society, without that, things will always get sucked down into the sewer of capitalism and its system of accumulation, its way of organizing the basic activity of society and the way people relate and the way they think about things. Now, how did the world get to be the way it is? How did it come about that for thousands of years, history has been the history of one society after another and one empire after another based on domination, plunder, exploitation, and oppression? Well, let's take a few examples from history to help illustrate this briefly. Let's go back to ancient Mexico, long before the Aztecs, thousands of years ago. Let's go back to the Olmec civilization that developed in a part of Mexico, in the area that generally now is Veracruz, near a river called the Coatzacoalcos River. Even before that time, when a civilization developed on the basis of farming, the people in Mexico, the ancient peoples in Mexico, lived largely by gathering and hunting. They were to a large degree dependent on the things they found and the things they could hunt. But over hundreds of years, records of archaeology, what's been dug up and discovered, has revealed that the people's life changed, their way of life changed after a certain point, partly because the climate changed, and also partly because the animals that they were hunting and depended on for their livelihood to a large degree got killed off, partly by the hunting they were doing themselves and partly by the changes in the climate and other changes. So they could no longer live in this way that they've been living for hundreds of years. And so they migrated and they came to this area near the Coatzacoalcos River in what is now Veracruz in Mexico. And they settled down and began another way of life, a life based on settled farming and settled society living in one place and doing the farming. Now you hear people talk about land all the time and how important land is. Without land, you don't have anything. This is true. But what's also very true and important to understand is that all land is not equal. All land is not equally fertile. All land is not equally productive. For example, if you drive around and you see rows of trees where there weren't any trees before, you can bet there's probably a body of water or a river running through there that's enabled those trees to grow in that spot where there weren't trees in other places. And one of the things about rivers in particular, and everybody knows this who's gone into farming, is that the irrigation from the rivers of the soil nearby makes that soil more fertile. It makes it more productive. So that those people in this ancient Mexican society or civilization who happened for one reason or another to end up with land more favorably situated, closer to the river, more fertile, more productive, over a period of time, not in a few days or a few weeks or years even, but over a period of time, those people came to be in a superior position over people whose land was farther away from the river or in one or another way was less fertile and less productive. And you could see how that would happen because they're growing and exchanging things among themselves, and those who can produce more are going to come out on top. And gradually, over a period of time, in this area, and I'm using this as an example of things that happened all over the world, not exactly the same way, but in similar ways, those people began also to develop more time, more leisure time, to engage in political activity, to engage in art, and to engage in politics. And gradually they emerged as the ruling group within society, and other people either were having to trade with them in an inferior position or lost their land altogether because they went under and had to end up working for these people who had more and more land. And this is revealed in the pottery and in other things that archaeology has discovered. You see the different strata, the different groups, the hierarchy of that society reflected in the art that was used in the ceremonies and in other things that they did in that society. And the same or a very similar thing also happened in ancient Egypt, way back before the pharaohs. Once again, as with the Coatzacoalcos River in ancient Mexico with the Olmec civilization, the Nile River in Egypt is very fertile. And those people who developed land ownership around the Nile came to be in a superior position over others in that general area who were farther away from the Nile and or in other ways had land that was less fertile and less productive. And you got the kind of society that emerged even before the pharaohs and developed further, which was a society of great inequalities, with a ruling class of the pharaohs and other classes underneath them down to the very poor peasants and slaves who were exploited by them. So these were great civilizations, yes, but they also had great inequalities and exploitation and oppression. And this is how this developed. Not because somebody sat down and said one day, I want to develop a society where I'm the pharaoh and everybody else has to work for me. And everybody worships me as being a supernatural being. That's not how it happened. It happened more out of these conditions that changed and the ways in which people found themselves situated because of these changing conditions. And with this came the domination of men over women. In early human societies, it was really only possible for women and not men to raise children, especially when the children were very young. For example, there was no formula to feed babies. They had to be nursed, and of course only women could nurse them. For some time in ancient society, this was just a kind of division of labor between men and women. And it did not necessarily lead to one having a superior position over the other. But when property and wealth became privately owned by different individuals, then this division of labor became bound up with how wealth was acquired. Men who didn't have to care for children, especially when they were young, but in general, were more in a position to engage in many different kinds of activities that led to acquiring things as privately owned wealth. So the men came to dominate this privately owned wealth. And then it became crucial for a man to know who his children, and especially his male children, were, so he could pass his wealth on to them, and they would inherit his private possessions and not someone else's children. And this led in turn to men insisting on more control over women, especially over the women they took as wives. From that point on, through different systems in which wealth was accumulated as the private property of particular individuals, the domination of men over women has been maintained, with all the consequences and suffering this has brought about. So basically, out of these early differences between some people with more favored situations and more wealth than others, out of this grew all the other divisions in which one part of society and one or a few countries in the world exploit and oppress the rest. Now again, people did not see ahead to all the consequences that would result from the changes they made in their way of life, as for example in ancient Mexico and Egypt, or ancient India and China, or Mesopotamia, the area around what is now Iraq. When people changed their way of life in this way, when they established agriculture and settled populations that carried out this farming, they did not foresee all the bigger changes this would set in motion. They made these changes in their way of life, or what is called their mode of producing and exchanging things among themselves. They made these changes in order to deal with the circumstances they were facing then, because there was a need and because people developed a way of dealing with these new circumstances. They did not know and could not know that this would lead to all the things that have happened in human society over thousands of years up to the present time, and all the things we are taught to assume are just the natural order of things. They had no understanding of world history, and they had not developed a scientific understanding of the basic ways in which things develop and change in nature and in society. It is only in the past 200 years, more or less, only with the development of modern technology and science, only with the way society has been organized to make use of this technology and science, only with the ways in which all parts of the world have become much more closely interconnected and bound up together. It is only on the basis of all this that a fundamental understanding of the development of things in nature and society has become possible, and a method has been brought forward for investigating the many different things and the many different changes in nature and society. This technology and science and the changes that have accompanied them have been under the control of the capitalists, and in their hands this has brought tremendous suffering to the vast majority of humanity. But now the means of producing and distributing the things people need, and the means for understanding and changing the world, have grown beyond the ability of the capitalists to make use of them in a rational way. Yet the capitalists will not let go of their control and domination. And so capitalism continues to cause tremendous suffering all over the world. But now, for the first time in human history, after thousands and thousands of years, in which society has developed in ways that saw one part enslaving and exploiting the greater part in one form or another, now, finally, there is a basis to put an end to that, and for people to consciously and cooperatively work and struggle together to keep on knowing and changing the world for the common benefit. This history of the world, in which one part of humanity dominates and exploits the great majority, is not just a matter of a few people with bad ideas. Some people want to fuck over other people, so that's why we're in the mess we're in. Ideas arise out of the overall situation people find themselves in, and the ways in which they interact with each other and with the outside world. And in order for someone's ideas to be put into effect, there has to be a basis for this in the real world. Let's look at some examples from history that can help illustrate this point. Why did Columbus sail to the Americas trying to get to India? That's where he was trying to go. And that's why he called the native peoples he met in the Americas Indians. And then he went on to slaughter some and enslave many others. Why was Columbus bankrolled by the King and Queen of Spain to make this voyage? Well, one of the big factors was that the route from Europe to the Far East was blocked to the Europeans. This is a very important route for trade and for developing economic relations all over the world. Why was it blocked? Well, because the Crusades didn't completely succeed. And there was another power there, the Islamic Empire, occupying strategic places in the Middle East, so the Europeans couldn't go through that landmass. They had to try to find another way all the way around on the ocean to get to the Far East where they wanted to go. This was at a time, a little more than 500 years ago, when capitalism was beginning to rise in Europe. This set off a mad race among all these European countries for new worlds to conquer and plunder, for people who could be exploited without mercy and without limit, and for resources to get as cheaply as possible on the basis of this exploitation, and for expanding trade and markets for goods produced in Europe. To paraphrase Karl Marx, the founder of the communist movement, capitalism comes in the world dripping with blood from head to toe. Its beginnings are marked by the widespread use of child labor, hunting down people in Africa to enslave and ship to plantations in the Americas, conquering the indigenous populations in places like Mexico, Bolivia, and Peru, and working them literally to death in the silver mines, and in general carrying out conquest and plunder throughout the world. Let's take another example. The invention of the cotton gin and its effects on slavery. The cotton gin was a very simple device that was developed around 1800, which made it much easier and faster to separate out the cotton fiber from the cotton seed. This was a big problem for the plantation owners because with the slaves doing it by hand, it took so long that after a while it wasn't profitable to grow cotton. So much labor had to go into doing this, and they got so little out of it in such a period of time that it wasn't profitable to grow cotton. And slavery, at least in cotton growing, was on the verge of almost dying out. And I'm sure a lot of slaves said, "God damn that Eli Whitney inventing that cotton gin." But once the cotton gin was invented, this gave a whole new lifeblood to slavery. Because now you could use this machine, a very simple mechanical device, to separate out the cotton fiber from the cotton seed, and you could whip the slaves to pick a lot more cotton and quickly get it turned into fiber to be sold elsewhere. You see, slavery in the United States was tied into and bound up with the world market of capitalism. For example, cotton picked by slaves on plantations in the southern U.S. was often sold to the owners of capitalist textile mills in England, where child labor was widely and viciously exploited in turning this raw cotton into cotton clothes. The drive of capitalism to work people harder and more intensely and to expand production to make greater profit, and the demand of the English textile mill owners and other capitalists for more and more cotton and other raw materials. This set much of the pace of slave work in America, especially after the cotton gin was invented. This acted as yet another whip, lashing the slaves to carry out more back-breaking work in order to feed the machinery of capitalist accumulation. Well, here's another example. Why is there a state in the United States today called West Virginia? Some of you who follow sports also know that the sports teams there are called the West Virginia Mountaineers. That gives you a clue as to why there's a West Virginia. Used to be all part of one state, Virginia. But most of Virginia was flat land, very good for plantations in which slaves could be worked in masses. But the western part that became West Virginia is very mountainous. That's why the teams there are called Mountaineers. It's very rocky, and you got these mountains that go up and down, and you can't even hear or see from one to the other. It wasn't a very good place to have plantations. Slavery in that form was not profitable there. So when the Civil War broke out, the people in the main part of Virginia were the heart of the Confederacy. But the people in the western part of Virginia broke off and didn't go with the Confederacy because their interest didn't lie with the slave system. It isn't that the people in West Virginia necessarily had better ideas. Maybe they developed some when they took part in the struggle against the Confederacy. But the origin of all this, the reason why there's a West Virginia, is not because the people there had better ideas in the abstract. It's because their conditions were different. And there wasn't a basis for slavery there. Ideas develop and are applied in relation to the material and social conditions people face, the ways in which people interact with each other and with nature. So for capitalism and every system based on exploitation and oppression, the only kinds of ideas it can produce and the kinds of ideas it promotes as the ruling ideas are, not surprisingly, ideas that justify all this exploitation and oppression, that teach people that this is the natural order of things, and that encourage people to try to become big dogs in this dog-eat-dog world. If this kind of world, this kind of system, if this were all that is possible, that'd be one thing. And you see people, even those who are brutally oppressed under this system, as long as they believe this is the only kind of world that's possible, you see them going along with this all the time. I got to get mine. I got to get what I can get within this. It's time to get yours. This reminds me of the story of the prisons in California, and in particular what was called the Corcoran Shoe. where the guards there would take prisoners and they'd tell them stories about each other, get them angry at each other, and they'd literally put them in pens like in the old Roman Colosseum, and they'd let them out of the pens and they'd come in and start fighting with each other, sometimes to the death. And the guards would be standing above watching all this, laughing and betting on the outcome, and if it got out of hand, they'd shoot one or more of the prisoners. This was a whole scandal that finally broke into the open in the California prisons. Well, if you just look from inside that, here you are, and the door opens and you run out in this arena and you start throwing hands and everything else you can with the other person who's there, you might say, I'm a bad motherfucker. I'm handling this situation. But if you back the camera up a little bit and look at the larger picture, what's happening? You're being handled. You're being put in this horrible situation by these people standing above you, laughing, betting, and ready to kill you if they see it in their interest. And that's a miniature picture, a microcosm, as they say, of what the world is like today and the way that people get caught up in going along with this. You hear these people say, I'm on this corner selling my product. I'm regulating the corner. You ain't regulating shit. You're just being regulated. You're just being put there and allowed to be there as long as what you're doing serves the people who really regulate things, who really run this system, for as long as it serves them or doesn't get in their way. You hear people say, sometimes they get caught up in all this stuff about the hood. This is our hood. Can't nobody come in here and take over our hood. This is not your hood. You don't own this. You don't run it. You don't control it. The people who own it and run it and control it are just using you. They're just letting you be played like this and carry on with all this foolishness and dangerous stuff, killing each other off because it serves their interests, while they're keeping you in these miserable conditions, not really different than the prisoners in the Corcoran shoe. It makes me think of a situation where you walk into a scene where there's a man got a gun in one hand and a big club in the other, and he's got everybody lined up. And he goes down the line breaking everybody's legs. And somebody jumps up and says, all right, Dan, I'm going to be the baddest broke-leg motherfucker there is. Something's wrong here. What we need to be doing is saying, hey, that man's breaking everybody's legs. Let's get together and stop that motherfucker from breaking everybody's legs. Now, I understand how people try to make the best of their circumstances. They say, you didn't give me nothing else, you didn't leave me nothing else, so I'm going to take this, and at least this way I can get some respect before I go out. So we can understand this. But again, let's step back and look at the larger picture, the larger world. Because we, the masses of people, are capable of much greater things than this. We are capable of completely and radically changing our circumstances, changing all of society to get rid of circumstances like these. What happens in the world affects us, and we can affect the world. And when all is said and done, we can change the whole world together with people like us all over the world. So to sum up the basic point, to step back and look at the sweep of history, since the time thousands of years ago when people began to accumulate surpluses, by surplus I mean an amount beyond what they needed for their mere survival, when they began to accumulate surpluses, and especially once groups of people settled down, domesticated animals like cattle, oxen, and horses, and began developing agriculture, and things like the mining of metals. Since that has happened, the way society has been is that a few have benefited at the expense of the many. Small groups have controlled and dominated the wealth and power and the means to create wealth and exercise power through exploiting and oppressing the great majority. And not just wealth and power. In the same way, they have exercised the activity of their minds on the basis of forcing others to slave with their backs and their hands. They have acquired and monopolized things like science, philosophy, the arts, and so on, and have used this to further reinforce their rule. They have promoted the idea that they deserve to rule, that they are destined to do so because of their superior nature, and because this is also the decree and the plan of some imaginary divine being or the will of heaven. This is the way it was in the ancient empires in China and India, in Mexico, Greece, and Rome, in Persia and ancient Babylon, in Egypt and other parts of Africa. This is the way it has been throughout history all over the world since that time. And today we have the U.S. empire and Bush and all them. But the time in history, the situation in human society where things have to be this way, that time is over. The basis already exists to meet the needs of the people throughout the world and to put an end to the vast, horrible, and completely needless suffering and misery that people are going through. That people all over the world, and yes, millions and tens of millions of people within the U.S. itself, are forced to endure. There's the basis right now for everyone to have enough food, shelter fit for human beings, and things like medical care to enable them to lead healthy lives. Yet at the same time, 40,000 children die every day in the third world from starvation and diseases that could easily be prevented or treated, while people all over the world, including in the U.S., are in their millions and billions denied the means to a decent life that should be possible for all. No longer is it necessary for things to be this way. The basis exists for the first time in history to bring into being a whole different way that people understand and change the world. A whole new way they live and relate to each other. A world where, grounded in an abundance of material things to be shared by all, and grounded in a scientific approach to understanding reality, grounded in that, people will voluntarily and consciously cooperate with each other to continue expanding the common store of abundance for all and the common store of humanity's knowledge, and where at the same time individuals' imagination and their creative energies will be continually and increasingly given space and given flight. A new and better world is possible, and with all the painful labor and pangs of birth that is involved, a new world is in birth. We need revolution. We need a whole new society, a radically different world. And this is not only possible, it is what the world is straining toward. It is what cries out to be done. In the world today, societies are divided into different classes. What do I mean by class? It's not that old thing about having class or a classroom you sit in school. In using the term class here, I am referring to the fact that there are large groups of people in society who share a common situation. And I am talking about the relations between those large groups of people. V.I. Lenin, the leader of the first successful revolution that brought a socialist state into being, the Russian Revolution of 1917, gave us a very important definition of classes in this sense. Lenin said that classes are large groups of people in an historically evolved situation who are distinguished from each other by first their relation to the system of ownership of means of production, and also their role in the overall production process in society, and by their place in the distribution of society's wealth. What the fuck does that mean? Let's go through this and break it down. First, these relations are historically evolved. This refers to the fact that people do not just decide to organize society any old way they wake up and think about doing it one day. The society people find themselves in, and the place they find themselves in within that society, is shaped by what the generations before them did, what their circumstances were, and how they interacted with nature and with each other in producing and distributing the necessities of life. The social relations, customs and traditions, the political systems, cultures, and ways of thinking they developed on the basis of their economic activity and their economic relations, or their mode of life, and the ways in which these things were changed as their societies developed and as they faced new circumstances and new challenges. We don't get to just start out and say we want society to be any old way. We inherit from previous generations, and on that basis, we can recognize the possibility for change and bring about change. This is what it means to say that relations in society, including basic relations of different groups or classes of people, are historically evolved. This is what it means to say that at any given time, the structure of a society, that is, the existence and arrangements of the different parts that make up that society, is historically evolved and doesn't just flow out of somebody's ideas at a given time. And in any society in which there are different and unequal groups, where one group exploits and oppresses the others, the basic structure of that society will be marked by its division into different classes. To understand this more fully, let's get into the rest of Lenin's definition of classes. He basically said there are three parts to this. First, what's your relationship in terms of ownership of the means of production? What does that mean? Means of production are things like factories, machinery, land, all the things that are the basis for creating wealth. If you own a lot of those, then you're in a position where you don't have to do very much work other than to make sure that other people are being exploited to produce wealth for you. And naturally, since you own a big part of those means of production, the means to create wealth, and you got other people working for you, you are going to be in a position to get the largest share of the wealth that's distributed in society. But let's say you don't own a factory or some other workplace, you're just a manager there, a middle-level manager, and you order other people around, but in turn you're ordered around. You don't really own the factory or the machines or the land or the means of production in general. You're just a functionary, getting other people to work to create wealth for the people that do own it. So your role is to get those other people to work. And since you occupy that place and play that role, you get a little more wealth than they do, but not nearly as much as the people that own the whole thing. And let's say you're on the bottom of this whole thing, the ones that have to do the work, the ones that have the invisible, if not visible, whip to your back, the whip of hunger and the threat of not being able to care for your family if you don't work. You don't own anything of all this, and you don't order anybody around. You're just ordered around. And your role in this is just to put your back to it and work. And so naturally, given the fact that you don't own any of these means of production and you're not occupying any special place in this overall process of labor and production, you get the smallest part of the wealth that's distributed in society. And that's what Lenin said when he talked about different classes and how you determine what class people are in. It's not just a matter of income. For example, if you go into a poor neighborhood and you see poor people running a little mom and pop store, they may have almost no income, but they're different than somebody else who works for them or who works for some other company because they own a little piece of property. They own a little bit of the, not really the rock, but maybe a little pebble. And they think a little differently about things because they own a little piece of property. They're a small property owner. They're poor, they don't have much income, and we should definitely seek to unite with them and involve them in the revolution. But they do not have the same position and exactly the same outlook as somebody who doesn't have any of that kind of ownership, even of a small store, and who works for them as their employee or who works for some other big company. So this distinction of understanding the different classes in society and what roles they play and what kind of outlook being in a different class is likely to lead people to have is very important, even when you're talking about relations among the people. Now, all this goes back to what was said earlier in reviewing the historical evolution of class society in ancient civilizations like Egypt and Mexico, or China, India, Persia, and Mesopotamia. All of these were societies divided into classes, a ruling class and other classes that were dominated by it, down to the slaves or the peasants or others who in one form or another were forced to work their lives away for the benefit of the class on top, which ruled the society. Wherever these classes has existed, there has been conflict between them. The needs of the ruling class and those of the classes it has oppressed and exploited have been in opposition to each other. And in many cases, this was a life and death situation, especially for those who were exploited and oppressed. This conflict of interest between these different classes gave rise to struggle between them. This struggle often became very sharp, and once the conditions had been developed to make this possible, this struggle could lead to the actual overthrow of the ruling class and the rise to power of a new ruling class. This is why in writing the original Communist Manifesto over 150 years ago, Karl Marx, together with Friedrich Engels, said that from the time human societies were divided into different classes, history has been the history of class struggle. In the past history of humanity, this did not lead to the end of a situation where one class exploited others, but it did lead to a new class of exploiters ruling society, and a new mode of exploitation. What is completely new in the world today is the existence and role of a class that can lead all the oppressed people out of this madness, to put an end to this horror, and to lead humanity to a whole new stage of history, a whole different world, without any exploitation and oppression, a communist world. This class is the proletariat. Now, proletariat is a word from the Latin language, the language that was used in the ancient Roman Empire. Proletariat refers back to that Roman Empire, to the mass of people who came into the cities, especially Rome itself, from other parts of the empire because they couldn't live elsewhere in the empire anymore. In those ancient days, these people, these proletarians, were largely left without a regular way to make a living. But today, proletariat refers to the class of people who can live only by working for someone else, and who can work only so long as their work enriches someone else, creates enough profit for them, and in particular for those who control the economy and are in a position, therefore, of hiring and of firing people. The proletariat includes many who are in and out of work, or even out of work for a long time, but who are called back into work when the capitalists need them. It serves the interests of the capitalist class to maintain a large pool of people in this kind of a desperate situation. It enables the capitalists not only to exploit those people when it suits their interests, it also makes it easier for the capitalists to keep down the wages of other workers as well, and to more fully exploit the proletariat, or the working class as a whole. This was very graphically illustrated, for example, in the movie Bowling for Columbine. In there, he showed a situation where a woman who had been on welfare, once again with this whole welfare to work thing, was forced to go to work. Her welfare was taken away from her. Of course, she had kids, so she had to try to find someone to take care of her kids, but no child care money was provided. And if the kids got sick, she needed health care for them, but no health care money was provided. She had to take a bus and go long hours to work in a mall somewhere and try to find a way to leave her kids with someone else. Well, obviously, this would put her in a vulnerable situation to be very viciously exploited. But it also meant that the capitalists could say to other people, I don't have to pay you $10 or $12 an hour to do that job. This woman here has to do it for $6.35 an hour. Otherwise, she loses everything, and her kids have nothing. And this was very graphically shown in this movie, that there's not only does this kind of thing enable them to exploit the people who are in and out of work more viciously, but enables them to push down the whole level of living of the working class as a whole and to exploit them overall in a more vicious way. Now, in the U.S., there is a large middle class, as we all know and we're always told about. All the politicians get up and talk about we have to preserve the middle class. And as many of them as possible must be won to revolution. But in fact, quiet as it's kept, the proletariat is the largest class of people in this society. And the most basic bedrock section of the proletariat are the millions and millions of people who are bitterly exploited, working for very little when they work at all, forced into conditions of poverty, struggling at every turn just to make it and keep things together. This includes many black, Latino, and Asian people and Native Americans who are also discriminated against and oppressed just because of what nationality or race they are. And of course, there are millions of recent immigrants who are part of the proletariat in the U.S., many of them also in this bedrock section. But this bedrock section of the proletariat also includes large numbers of white people working in shit jobs, barely making it, held down, and also looked down on by those on top. It is as a class, and not as individuals or small groups, that the proletariat can throw off its conditions of exploitation and oppression and can in fact radically change things, can transform all of society to eliminate exploitation and oppression altogether. It is by overcoming the divisions that the historical development of society has created and that the capitalist system thrives on and reinforces. It is only through overcoming this that the proletariat can unite to fight for its interests as a class. The interests of proletarians as a class lie in fighting against and getting rid of all oppression in all parts of society and all over the world. Otherwise, the proletariat can never get rid of its conditions of exploitation and oppression. Why and how is it that the proletariat and the world outlook that represents the proletariat must be in the lead in this revolutionary struggle? The proletariat is large. It is made up of tens of millions of people in the U.S., even though they try to disappear it, make it invisible, and claim it doesn't exist. But more than that, because its labor is the basis on which wealth is produced, it has a strategic position within the capitalist economy and within society as a whole. And it has a tremendous potential power because of this. And more than that, the way in which proletarians work together when they work is not in an isolated, individualized way, each off by herself or himself making something, but in a highly socialized way, with many, many people contributing to the process and the final product. And as I pointed to already, today this is more and more an international process, with workers from many different countries taking part in the process of producing and distributing different products. Cars, televisions, clothes, food, computers, and just about anything you can think of. No single person, and not even any single small group of people, can take these things and say, I made this, this is mine. Or the three of us made this, this is ours. All these products are made through the combined efforts of many, many people. Even though under the capitalist system, this is done under the control and under the dictates of capitalists and is ruled by the first commandment of capitalism: profit, profit, and more profit for the capitalists. But all of this provides the basis for proletarians to understand, more readily than other classes and groups in society, the actual nature of the capitalist system and the need to overthrow this system and replace it with one based on cooperative and collective principles, including collective ownership of the means of production that I've referred to: the land, the raw materials, the machinery, and other technologies that are used in producing things. And all this provides the basis for proletarians, more than any other class and group in society, to deeply want to and to feel the need to throw off this capitalist system in which proletarians are exploited, and to bring into being a new economy and a whole new society, and ultimately a whole new world based on cooperative and collective principles. But this understanding does not come automatically or spontaneously. One day you wake up and say, hey, I'm a proletarian, I'm exploited, let's have revolution. In this kind of society, there are other factors working against it, pulling people in other directions. The proletariat needs its own revolutionary party, its communist vanguard, to enable it to become aware of and to consciously play this historic role. What does vanguard mean? It means the advance guard, the advance leading force of a movement, a struggle, a revolution. At the same time, in order to realize its revolutionary interests, to bring about an end to its own conditions of exploitation and an end to all oppression, the proletariat, with the leadership of its vanguard party, must build and lead a broad united front. It must unite all who can be united against the capitalist imperialist system and its never-ending outrages and injustices. It must unite all who can be united in the struggle to overthrow and abolish this system and to revolutionize all of society and the world as a whole. Now let's imagine, let's step out of this world that they keep us chained in, and let's imagine what this future world can and will be like. When we finally get to the final goal of communism, there won't be the relations of exploitation and oppression that are so commonplace and that mark all of society today, and that we are told over and again are just the natural order of things and the way things have to be. As Karl Marx pointed out, the communist revolution leads to what we Maoists call the four alls. That is, the abolition of all class differences among people, the abolition or the end to all the production or economic relations underlying these class differences and divisions among people, the ending of all the social relations that go along with these economic or production relations, oppressive relation between men and women, between different nationalities, between people in different parts of the world. All that will be put an end to and moved beyond. And finally, the revolutionizing of all the ideas that go along with this whole way, this whole capitalist system, these whole social relations. In place of this, what will be the guiding principles in society, consciously and voluntarily taken up by people, not forced on them, but consciously and voluntarily taken up as the basis for having abolished exploitation, oppression, and inequality. In its place will be collective and cooperative principles, aiming for the common good, and at the same time within that, individuals and individuality flourishing in a way that has never been possible before. The first great step or great leap on the road to communism is seizing power from the capitalists. Without that, none of this is possible. But seizing power from them opens the way to making the advance to communism. Socialism is the new society established after the seizure of power. Socialism is three things: a new economic system, a new political system, and a transition to the final goal of communism. Let's talk about what this will make possible right away once power has been seized. Let's talk about the whole different nature of socialism as a society in which the masses of people are digging up the old, rotten, and putrid soil of capitalism and moving forward to the goal of a communist world. Let's imagine in healthcare, instead of going to a doctor or a hospital if you can afford it, being insulted from the time you get there, being treated as if you don't belong there, being talked down to and acted as if you don't even understand your own body and your own health conditions, being discriminated against if you're a certain nationality or if you're a woman, being treated like you maybe not sophisticated to understand what's really going on here. Instead of being told, we're sorry, you need a treatment, but you don't have the money to pay for it. Imagine if, because we had a whole different society where the wealth were not only created, but were controlled and managed by the people, health care for basic necessities were free, and health care for everything else were very cheap, and if you couldn't pay it right away, they let you pay it over time. And imagine more than that, if you went to the hospital and the staff, and not just the nurses, but even the doctors sat down with you and treated you like a human being and said, tell me about... And if they didn't, other people there would get on them and say, what's wrong with you? That's the old way things used to be. We got a new way here. Imagine if they asked you about your history or about your children and what your concerns were. Imagine if they thought your opinion and your view of things and your understanding of things actually mattered. But let's imagine more than that. Imagine if people like you from the neighborhood were part of a committee together with the staff and the doctors and the administrators who actually ran the hospitals and the health care clinics. And your opinion, when your input was drawn on all the time. Imagine if the doctors actually got together with the staff people and discussed things from their point of view. What are you seeing about how this hospital could be run better? How can we give better care to the patients? How can we take better care of people's needs? Let's talk about work. Imagine, first of all, that you actually wanted to go to work. Imagine instead of being treated basically like an animal, being bossed around, treated as if all you were there for was to bend your back, but you had no idea about how things ought to be, that you couldn't contribute anything, that you had no ideas that were worth anything, that you were just always trying to get out of everything and do as little as you could, which of course you are under the capitalist system. But imagine if the conditions were changed so that weren't what you were doing. Imagine if you wanted to contribute. Imagine if your opinion were actually valued. Imagine if the character of work changed. Imagine if you knew when you produced something that it was for the good of the people, that it was helping the people's health needs or their needs for housing or their needs for textbooks for education that really told the truth. Imagine if besides that you were actually drawn into the administration of the place where you worked. If people like you chose representatives to be part of the committee running that place, together with the people who more full-time administered and the managers. Imagine if the administrators and the manager actually came down and worked with you some hours during the week and talked with you and saw the situation from where you were. Imagine if you held discussions where you worked and larger discussions among representatives of people about what was all this work for? What are we producing this for? How is this going to help the people in society? How can we support the struggle of the people throughout the world better through what we're producing through our work? Imagine if that were what work is like. Imagine housing. What if the housing, instead of belonging more to the rats than to the people, were actually decent housing fit for human beings? Imagine if everybody had a decent place to live, and more than that, imagine if it weren't just everybody in their own little place trying to keep as much away from everybody else as they can, and you had to have 6 locks on your door so that all your shit didn't get stolen. Imagine if you actually had neighborhoods and communities that were being beautified, where flowers are being planted and playgrounds, not glass-infested, broken-down shit, but actual playgrounds for people, for children, for others. Imagine if people were encouraged to hang out together, to talk with each other, to form committees, to actually talk about, okay, what are we doing in this neighborhood, and how does it relate to the society and the world as a whole? And how does this neighborhood relate to the way people work? And how can we help each other out? And how many meals do we want to all eat together? And how much do we want to allow for people to go and have their own meals in their own houses with their own families? How are we going to work all that kind of stuff out? Imagine if these are the kind of questions were being taken up in your neighborhood as well as in your work. And let's talk about work and housing together. Look at all these neighborhoods which, under the rule of the capitalist system, have been allowed and even encouraged to rot. Look at the youth and others just hanging out on the street corner with nothing to do or no way to do anything that doesn't get them into one kind of trouble or another. Imagine changing all that, because now we have the power over society, and we go to these youth and we say, here, we're going to give you training. We're going to give you education. We're going to bring you materials. We're going to enable you to go to work to build some beautiful housing and playgrounds and neighborhoods here for yourself and others who live here. Imagine if we said to them, you can not just work, you can be part of planning all this. You can be part of figuring out what should be done for the benefit of the people, to make the society better, and to contribute to making a whole different and radically better world. Imagine if for these youth they could have a way to not just to make a living, building housing, hospitals, community centers, and parks, and other things people need, but at the same time they could have the opportunity and the dignity of working together with people throughout society to build a whole better world. There's absolutely no reason why these kind of things aren't possible, except that we live under this system which makes them impossible. Let's talk about education. Just like imagining people wanted to go to work, imagine kids who actually wanted to go to school. Imagine if they weren't degraded and insulted all the time, and treated as if they couldn't possibly learn anything or have any important ideas. Imagine if the educational system actually told them the truth, and help them to understand about the world and history and nature and society. Imagine if it actually helped them to think critically, to challenge everything. Yes, the teachers, yes, and yes, even the party and its leaders. What if the educational system drew the kids in, along with the teachers and staff, and said, this is a whole new society, a new world. What are your ideas about how this could all be done better? Imagine if the education combined practical things with theory, so the things they were studying and learning, they would go out into society and talk to people who did those things. Or they invite people in, instead of casting the old people off like useless garbage. Invite the old people in to talk about the horrors of the old society and their experience and what the new society means to them, and have them have an exchange with these kids in the schools. And have the kids learn practical knowledge as well as studying theory and learning science and grappling with philosophy. The same in science. Right now, science often scares people. It's intimidating. You're taught that you can't possibly understand these things, that it's all mysterious. It's not the scientists' fault. It's the kind of society, or at least not mainly, it's the kind of society we have and the way in which they want people to be divided into different classes, groups, and castes. So that some people use their minds and other people can only use their bodies or just waste away or die fighting in a war. Imagine if science were brought to everybody and made the exciting thing it is for everybody. Struggling to investigate and learn about the world and the way it works, and all the different things both here on earth and in the far, what the religious people call the heavens. Imagine if here in the realm also of science, the scientists got together with the quote-unquote ordinary people, with the students in the schools, with the workers in workplaces, and talked to them about science, drew them into scientific experiments and investigation, got their ideas, found out the questions they wanted to know about the world, and then worked up ways of people uniting together and cooperating to develop experiments and investigation in science that pursued these things. Imagine if science, like education and all these other parts of society, actually were serving to transform the society, to get rid of oppression, exploitation, and inequality, and to help the people throughout the world wage the revolutionary struggle to do the same. Imagine if we had a whole different art and culture. Come on, enough of this bitches and hoes and SWAT teams kicking down doors. Enough of this get low bullshit. And how come it's always the women that have to get low? We already have a situation where the masses of women and the masses of people are pushed down and held down low enough already. It's time for us to get up and get on up. Imagine if we had a society where there were a culture that, yes, was lively and full of creativity and energy and, yes, rhythm and excitement, but at the same time, instead of degrading people, lifted us up. Imagine if it gave us a vision and the reality of what it means to make a whole different society and a whole different kind of world. Imagine if it laid out the problems for people in making this kind of world and challenged them to take up these problems. Imagine if art and culture too, movies, songs, television, everything, challenged people to think critically, to look at things differently, to see things in a different light, but all pointing toward how can we make a better world. Imagine if the people who created art and culture were not just a few handfuls of people, but all the masses of people with all their creative energy unleashed, and the time were made for them to do that and for them to join in with people who are more full-time workers and creators in the realm of art and culture, to bring forward something new that would challenge people, would make them think in different ways, that would make them be able to see things critically and from a different angle, and would help them to be uplifted and help them to see their unity with each other and with people throughout the world in putting an end to all the horrors that we're taught are just the natural order of things. Imagine all that. This is not some kind of fantasy I'm talking about. This is what's been done in socialist societies It's what's been done in the Soviet Union, and even more so in China in the time when our class, the proletariat, held power. This is what's been done in these spheres and every other part of society. Yes, we're going to have laws and a constitution in socialist society to protect the people, to protect their interests, and to protect their rights. But more than that, we're going to rely on the people. We're going to bring forward the people. We're going to enable them to wrangle with things and to thrash things out themselves collectively. We're going to lead them to challenge everything, to transform everything, to bring into being this whole new world and to do it together with the people of the world. And what I'm talking about, again, is not a fantasy. These are the things that have been done in the socialist societies that have existed, or they're the things that on the basis of that experience we have summed up and are learning more deeply need to be done. This is all possible. It's not some pipe dream. This is what happens when the mass of people rise up and take control over society. And this is what waits to be done. But that is not all. Not only will all these different spheres of society be radically different in ways that serve the needs and interests of the people. As I've been emphasizing, what makes all this possible is that the proletariat, with the leadership of its vanguard party, rules in this society, this new socialist society. It leads the masses of people to transform everything in society and finally in the world as a whole, to achieve those four alls that I spoke of earlier. It leads them to stand with and to do everything possible to support and assist the revolutionary struggles of people all over the world. In other countries where the proletariat has seized power and is moving to revolutionize all of society, and in those places where the proletariat and its allies are still struggling to throw off the rule of capitalism and to take the first great step of seizing power. In this new society, the proletariat rules over the capitalists who have been overthrown and others who try to drag people back to the capitalist system with all its outrages and horrors. This is the dictatorship of the proletariat. Rule backed by the armed force of the proletariat and masses of people over the exploiters and oppressors and wannabe exploiters and oppressors. Now, dictatorship is a big and scary word, and people say you shouldn't talk about it. Well, we're going to talk about it because we don't do what they say. Dictatorship is not what they tell us. Dictatorship is not the rule of one man standing up. Everything I say must be done or you'll be killed. Dictatorship may take a form that outwardly appears like that, but that's not the essence of what dictatorship is. No one person can rule and run a whole society. Dictatorship is rule by a group or fundamentally a class of people over a society. So long as classes are divided into societies are divided into different classes, there will always be the rule of one class or another. And that rule is a dictatorship because that class controls what we call the state. Now, by the state, I don't mean different states like in the United States, like Michigan or California or Florida or New York. What I mean by the state, in speaking in this context, is the machinery of government, and in particular, the machinery of force. The army, the police, and the courts and bureaucracies, that machinery of force that is used by those who control the government, the ruling class, to keep down and oppress the classes and groups in the society that it rules over. For example, in the U.S., the state is controlled by the capitalist class. That's why the police act the way they do, because they're part of the machinery of the dictatorship of the capitalist class. They're preserving and defending the property relations, the relations of exploitation and oppression that are fundamental to this system. So the state in this country is controlled by the capitalist class, and it is used to keep down and exploit the proletariat and other groups that are oppressed in this society. The essence of dictatorship, in whatever form it is, whether it has a person up there pounding on the table and acting like a maniac, or whether it's in a more disguised form, the purpose and the essence of dictatorship is a monopoly of power over the society, and in particular, a monopoly of force. See, that's the whole thing about the capitalist class and the way they rule the society. Their force is legitimate. Their violence against the people is legitimate. Their murder of the people is what? Justifiable homicide. Why? Because they have a monopoly on force. Because they control the police and the army, and that's why the police and the army do what they do in the service of this system and its relations. And even more than a monopoly of force, it's a monopoly of legitimate force, quote unquote. In other words, in any system which is ruled by any class, that class will claim for itself the exclusive right to use violence to maintain the society in the way that class wants it to be. And any violence of any other kind, and especially any violence that is in resistance to that order, that is in rebellion against that system, that violence is illegitimate. So the essence of dictatorship is the monopoly of force, and in particular, the claim to the monopoly of the legitimate use of force and violence to maintain society in the form it's in. And this is true whether or not you get to vote for which particular group of people administers that society and sets the army and the police loose on you when you try to resist their rule over that society. In opposition to the capitalist state, the dictatorship of the proletariat opens the possibility and provides the means for democracy to really and broadly be practiced among the masses of people, among the great majority of society, on a far greater scale and in a completely different way than the phony democracy of capitalism, which is really only politics in the interests of the capitalists, only democracy for the capitalist ruling class and those who serve it, and is really dictatorship over the proletariat and the great majority of society. Let's look at some examples. Look at the recent war against Iraq. Look at the massive outpouring of people protesting that war. Millions in the U.S. and tens of millions around the world. But more than 1 million people demonstrating on the same day in this country. An unprecedented event before a war even starts. It got so powerful that the New York Times had to write silly articles talking about, well, maybe there are two superpowers in the world now. The U.S. and the public opinion of the people throughout the world opposing the U.S. Unfortunately, they had a point. They were pointing to something real, to the real power of the people manifesting, demonstrating in that kind of way. But unfortunately, one of those quote-unquote superpowers has state power and the violent means to back it up, and the other one doesn't yet. And that's why they went to war anyway. Remember Bush? Oh, I don't determine policy on the basis of a focus group. He dismissed millions of people as a focus group. Why? Because you don't matter. Because this is not a society where the people's will is exercised, because this is a dictatorship. And this is when it comes to things like this is when we hear them talk about, well, you know, the role of leadership is not just to follow the people, it's to lead them. So if the people all oppose the war, we have to lead them into the war anyway. And this is when you see the dictatorship coming more clearly out into the open. They're serving, this class of politicians, or this group of politicians, is serving the interests of a class and a system, and under this system they cannot do anything else. But they have a great game going. It's one of the best scams that's been developed. Their election scam. What we call the voting trap. This is a game that they desperately want you to play, but it's a game you can never win. Just think about it. They say to the oppressed people, well, you know, you got to vote for one or the others. And they have it set up the way it's evolved, not just through conspiracy, but the way the different interests have worked themselves out, is that the Democrats more appealed to more of the oppressed people, to more of the poor people, to more of the working class people, to more of the people in the inner cities, to more of the black and Latino and other oppressed peoples. That's their role, that's their function. They appeal more to them. And you know, sometimes people think that you can maneuver within this. Well, we'll form a voting block, see? And then we'll go to the Democrats and say, well, you can't win without our swing vote. So if you don't do what we want, we're not going to vote for you. But you know what they're going to say? Who are you going to vote for? The Republicans? They got you coming and going with this game. It's a game you cannot win. It's a game they desperately want you to play. Because the thing is, they'll tell you, well, if you don't vote, then you have no say-so in the society. The simple fact is, by voting, you still have no say-so in how the society is run. Because the decisions are not made by the votes. You don't even get to vote on what you really want to vote on. By the time you get to vote, they already picked out everything you're voting on. What's a legitimate issue? Who's a legitimate candidate? Who can get tens of millions of dollars to run out here and have TV ads and everything else? Somebody raises something good, they're not a legitimate candidate. They'll tell you that. It's all being controlled by the same class of people that finances the candidates. They may give more money to one party or to another at a given time, but they're controlling the whole thing, and they know in the end, after the election's all over, they're going to go back to these same people and tell them this is how it has to be. They're going to work it out together with this political group of people that runs for office. So by the time you get to vote, they've already decided whom you can vote for and what you can vote for. Look at the 2002 congressional elections. People were desperately, millions of people were desperately wanting to vote for somebody that would be against this whole thing Bush was doing. This whole war in Iraq, this whole juggernaut, all this repression, everything else. They were begging the Democrats to come out and oppose it so they could go to the polls and vote against it. And the Democrats refused. There was no way in that election, if you wanted to vote against that you could vote against it. And to be honest, part of the reason why there were such massive demonstrations is because people were frustrated. They couldn't find an outlet within the workings of the system that they could express the opposition they wanted to express, so they came into the streets. And that's a good thing. And it's going to be even better when things reach a real crisis point and it's true on a much greater scale and we get to a whole revolutionary situation. Now, we're not going to draw the dividing lines between people who vote and people who don't vote. That would be a serious mistake. We have to unite with people to rise up and oppose this system, and if they go vote, let's get them back out on the street to do something that'll really matter. But voting is not going to change anything in the interests of the people. I was watching this Democratic Party debate the other day, and Sharpton got up and made a fairly clever comment. He said, well, they asked him about his comment that black people are tired of having the Democratic Party treat him like a mistress. So they said, what do you mean by this? And he said, well, what I mean is you got to go home with the one that brought you to the dance. We're the ones that are taking the Democratic Party to the dance, so they can't go home with those other interests. They got to go home with us. It doesn't work that way. Because you know what? You're not the one that brought them to the dance. The one that brought them to the dance are the same ones that run everything already. They're just running a game on you. And while they may not dance with you, they're certainly willing to take you for a ride. So it's one of the great things of this country, you see, that we have the great embodiment of democracy, the two-party system. Where would we be without these two parties? The Republic-Fascists and the Republicrats. But the simple fact is that neither of these parties and none of these bourgeois politicians, the ones who are supported by the capitalist class, represent the interests of the people, or ever could represent the interests of the people, or they would never get anywhere, and they would be crushed if they tried. We had a living example of this in the 2000 Republican Convention. It was a perfect example. It was such a perfect example, it was a great insult. The 2000 election was a great insult to the people in many ways. One way was Jerry Falwell got on television and he was being interviewed during the election, and he was asked his opinion on various things, and he said, well, candidate Bush has asked us to be quiet until after the election. Now right there they're telling you they're running a game on you. They're telling you, I'm not saying anything now because what I say might make you mad, so I'm going to wait till afterward and then we do what we want to do. That's an insult on top of an insult. They're running a game on you, and then they're telling you that they're running a game on you. And then they did the same thing At the Republican convention, the Democratic convention was this way too out in L.A., but the Republican convention really captured this because it went on 3 levels. On one level was the big show for the people, the big show of Republican inclusivity. Everybody was welcome. Remember, they even had Chaka Khan and The Rock there. They made a big show of inclusivity within a certain limit. Meanwhile, everything was already sewed up already as to what was going to happen. But even more fundamental than that, over in another place, literally in the dark, some of the news cameras got out there in the dark, and they showed you all these high rollers, all these big corporate heads and everything coming up in these other parts of the city, away from where the convention and the whole show was being held, to meet with Bush and his advisors to talk about what was really going to be done. And it was all right there. They ran a show and then they insulted us and put insult on top of insult. And once again, you go to the Democrats and say, you know, do something for us. Or what? You going to vote for them? This is a game we can never win. We need a whole different political system. We need a different dictatorship. We need a different class ruling society and involving the masses of people for the first time in running and transforming society. This is why we talk about the dictatorship of the proletariat, why it's necessary and what it's for. The dictatorship of the proletariat means democracy for the masses of people and dictatorship over the overthrown capitalists and other exploiters. In the new socialist society, we will need not just formal rights on paper for the masses of people, although we must have and will have that. But more than that, we need people to be politically active, to take part in an organized, informed, and politically conscious way in decision-making. And we need them to speak up, to voice their opinions, to raise their questions, to express their disagreements, to dissent and even to protest against officials and official policy when they feel they are wrong. We need them to explore and wrangle with all kinds of questions and ideas, to enter into and engage all the different spheres of society, including the many places where masses of people are now locked out under this system. But at the same time as we need all that, we need to restrict, and when necessary, yes, we need to suppress, to hold down and to stop the political activity of the overthrown exploiters and others who are actually and actively seeking to bring back the hell of the old society. We're not going to allow that. Think about it today. They moan and complain about how we're going to be dictatorial. But look at their prison system. You go to prison, you don't get all your rights. They convict you of a crime, they take away almost all your rights. And even after you get out of prison when you're on parole, they don't give you all your rights. They restrict you in all kinds of ways. They tell you, okay, you've been a menace to society. Now, you can't live in certain places. You can't stay out beyond certain hours. You can't associate with certain people. You have to have a certain kind of job. You have to report every week to us and tell us what you're doing. You can't drink liquor. You can't do this. You can't do that. And we want to know every goddamn thing you're doing because we're supervising you because you've been a menace to society. Well, think about it. Compare the people who rule this country and what they've done in the world. What kind of criminals are they? What level are they criminals compared to the petty crimes of the people that they're talking about? These people have committed monstrous crimes, much greater crimes than anyone who's in jail in the U.S. today, far beyond it, dwarfing it, making it seem insignificant, even though it's not in some cases. Why shouldn't we supervise them? Why shouldn't we put them in prison if need be? And why shouldn't we tell them, if you get out of prison, we're going to supervise you? You can't go do whatever the hell you want. You can't go conspire to commit more crimes and drive people back into the hell of it. You can't go figuring out how you can get back in power so you can bomb and murder millions of more people. No. We're going to supervise you, and you better report because we want to know what you're doing. And they should consider themselves lucky if that's all that happens. Now again, let me make clear, I'm not just talking about random acts here. There will be laws, there will be due process, there will be a constitution. But some things are rather easy to see, and some procedures and processes will be rather clear-cut. We'll gladly put these people on trial when the time comes. In the future society, whether we're there or not, I'm sure the people who are ruling will gladly put these people on society for the whole world to learn about the depth and the extent of the crimes they committed. And for the people as a whole, there will be laws, there will be due process, there will be constitutions, so that people do, and constitutional rights, so that people do not get caught up wrongfully, or at least so we minimize the possibility of that happening. But those people who have been responsible for these towering crimes cannot whine and complain if we take the measures necessary to prevent them or others from ever again committing these crimes. Among the masses of people, the millions and tens of millions of people, we need individuals to express themselves and to take initiative and be creative in doing all kinds of things and raising all kinds of ideas. In the future socialist society, with the dictatorship of the proletariat, with the rule of the masses of people over the overthrown exploiters and oppressors, and over those who are determined to be exploiters and oppressors, we will need lots of political activity and decision-making on the local level and among groups of people in particular situations, particular parts of society, like schools, workplaces, neighborhoods, and so on, where people can get together to wrestle with things and thrash things out together. But we will also need centralism, central decision-making and authority, so that the greater needs of society and the higher interests of the masses of people in the socialist country itself, but also throughout the world, can be realized and put into effect. Let's talk about this in practical terms. Let's talk about how it applies to the economy, for example. You can't just have everyone or small groups of people all doing their own thing without regard to the overall situation, or the interests of the people will not be served. For example, let's say we draw up an overall economic plan to figure out how much medicine, how many hospitals, how many playgrounds, how many schools, how much production of basic necessities, and other things and on that we need as part of this plan. And as part of this plan, one group of people is supposed to be making machines that will go to another factory to make medicine that will be sent to the hospitals and clinics so that people have the medicine when they need it. But let's say the people in the first factory who are supposed to be making the machines that are going to go to the next factory to make medicine say, "Oh, we don't want to do that. We want to make cotton candy." Or maybe something more serious, like we want to make clothes instead. Clothes is more useful than making these machines to make medicine for people. So we're going to make clothes, and maybe we can make some extra money, and then that'll be good for society too. Well, what's going to happen? The whole thing's going to break down. The machines are not going to get to the factory that's waiting for them so they can make the medicine, so it can get to the hospital that's waiting for the medicine, and the clinics and other places people need the medicine. So those people are going to go without medicine because these people thought it was more important to do their own thing and not have any hierarchy telling them what to do. So they sabotage the health care of the millions of people in the society, and if this gets reproduced over and over again, you sabotage the overall functioning of the society. Of course we need input from people. We just don't need top-down, we need bottom-up. We need plans to be drawn, which draw from the ideas of the mass of people in all these different situations. But then they need to be synthesized. They need to be brought together into an overall plan and taken back to the people to discuss how to implement this. And then you can't have just people going off doing any old thing they want, or as much as they might like it. The overall interests of the people are going to suffer greatly in health care and in every other way. Or let's take an even more obvious example. Let's talk about how this applies to the armed forces. Here again, you can't just have different parts of your armed forces, and we will need armed forces to protect what we want, or else we're a bunch of fools. You can't just have different parts of your armed forces all going off and doing their own thing either. Let's say that you draw up a battle plan. You're being attacked by an imperialist power. You're in a life and death situation. Whether your society is going to survive and all the people have shed blood for is going to be protected and defended, or whether it's going to be crushed, and the people are going to suffer terribly. And so you draw up a plan, and the plan says you have a main force that's going to go over here and attack this force of the enemy. And you're going to have a secondary force here that's going to do a holding action so that when the enemy tries to have reserves come to reinforce them, they'll be able to block them. Well, over here, making your main attack, since you're probably going to be up against an enemy that's going to be well fortified, have superior equipment and so on, you're going to need an overwhelming force. So you're going to have to devote an overwhelming force over here and have a smaller force over here, because that smaller force won't be fighting on the offensive, which is more difficult. It'll be fighting on the defensive, where it can dig in and just block these reinforcements that are coming. Well, suppose this secondary force that people in and say, what? Blocking action? Oh, man, that's weak. We don't want to do that. We want to attack somebody. So they all leave, and instead of blocking action, they all go off and look for some enemy forces to attack. And of course, they're not organized, they're not coordinated, it's not part of any battle plan, so they get wiped out. Meanwhile, all these other reinforcements they're supposed to block come up, and so instead of our attacking force being able to concentrate its forces here and use overwhelming numbers against this enemy that's more superiorly and technologically equipped, all of a sudden our force is surrounded. It's got this other force that's supposed to be blocked coming from behind it, this other force here, and it's crushed and defeated. Now, we can laugh about this, but when we get down, it's worth laughing about, but it's serious too. When you get down to the real deal, this is not funny. Yes, once again, we need a whole different kind of army which draws on the soldiers and gets their ideas about how we ought to fight, for what it talks about what we're fighting for, and how to most effectively fight for that. But when we come up with a plan for how to fight or how to do anything, we all have to pull together and not say, well, I want to do it a different way. In order to advance through socialism to the even greater goal of communism worldwide, we need to move beyond and overcome the wounds and scars left over from capitalism. That's one of our main missions, in fact, in socialist society and in the transition of socialism to communism. This means putting an end to all the inequalities that are so much a part of a society like the one we live under now. Inequalities, as I've spoken about, between men and women, between different nationalities, but also inequalities like the one that's described in the difference between mental and manual work. Now let me explain what that means. Mental work means like people who sit in offices and plan work largely with their minds. Manual work is obvious. Manual has to do with the hands. Mano has to do with the hands. Manual means working with your hands or your back. Another way to say it, physical labor and mental labor. In this society, there's a very great gap and division between people who work with their minds and people who work with their hands and their backs. And in general, the ones who work with their minds are the ones who lord it over the ones who work with their minds and their backs. That's another inequality that we have to overcome. This is a big gap in society. It runs through all of society and every part of society. And we're just told that's the way it is. Some people have superior minds. They are meant to think up ideas and come up with plans, and other people are meant to just carry them out because they have inferior minds. Or somehow they just didn't get a good education, so now all they can do is carry out the orders of others. All they can do is do the physical labor while these other people do all the thinking and the mental labor. This is a big division that has to be overcome. So is the division between men and women. All these inequalities. I think, for example, of China. Before the revolution succeeded and won power in China in 1949, a common thing for women in China is what's known as bound feet. Now this doesn't mean they just tied something around their feet. They took the feet of women, they bent the toes under and they broke their bones, crushed them, and then bound them in that way to give them small and dainty feet which would be more sexually appealing to men. This was done. Even prostitutes couldn't be prostitutes if they didn't have bound feet in most cases, let alone be a wife or in some other way be appealing to a man. Think of that brutal tyrant Mao Zedong, who led the people to do away with this time-honored tradition in China. Imagine going against the grain of all of nature and denying women the right to have their bones and their feet crushed and bound. When you look at China, you think in 25 years of socialism there, the great things that were accomplished in terms of women coming forward in every sphere of society. Think about even something like the arts in China. They made breakthroughs in the ballet. We hear all this terrible stuff about Shaanxing and everything, but you know something? They made breakthroughs in ballet in China, revolutionary ballets, that women were making moves in the ballet that had never been done before in the history of ballet anywhere in the world. These were women 25 years away from having their feet bound. And they tell us how horrible this was. Imagine them forcing these women to unbind their feet and dance in revolutionary ballets. But this gives you an idea of the tremendous inequalities. In this society, we don't have bound feet, but we sure as fuck have high heels that are ridiculous. And all for what? So your ass thrusts out and your booty looks better. This is the whole idea of it. It's the same thing, it's just a different form, maybe not as extreme. But these are just outward symbols of the much deeper oppression that has to be thoroughly uprooted, in the ways of thinking as well as the customs that have to be fully transformed by the conscious and willful act of the people, not simply by enforcing it. Then we have inequalities and differences between nationalities, which are very deep-seated throughout the world, and especially in this society. Everybody knows. And let's not pretend anything different, that it's not going to be easy to overcome the long years of oppression and racism that are deeply embedded in this society and, frankly, deeply ingrained in the thinking of the people. This is going to be a tremendous struggle. This is another great inequality we're going to have to overcome. There are also inequalities between different parts of the country, and in particular, between the city and the countryside. The countryside, on the one hand, is in more backward conditions, more isolated. The culture tends to be more backward. This is reflected in how people talk, you know. People say, oh man, you're country. It means you don't really know what's going on. You know, you're backward, you're kind of a fool, you don't really understand what things are happening. You know, it's true, the means of culture, the means of art, the means of education aren't distributed to the countryside in capitalist society the same way they are in the cities. The cities have their own problems. And the countryside does do very important things, such as providing food for people to eat. So we're going to have to work at this from both sides to overcome these inequalities. To work it out so that in the cities, some things that are valuable from the countryside are brought to the cities, and in the countryside, some things that are very valuable from the cities are brought to the countryside, and these inequalities are overcome from both sides as a whole new set of social relations and culture to go along with it is being developed. We have to overcome all these inequalities, not just in one society, but in the world as a whole in order to get to communism. This lopsidedness that I'm talking about, this has to be overcome throughout the world so that one or a few countries are not sucking the lifeblood out of the rest. This is one of the problems we'll face when we have a new society. We're not going to organize it and develop it anymore by exploiting people all over the world and paying them a few cents an hour and working children to death like that. So we're going to have to organize and do it ourselves without exploitation. Now, these inequalities have to be overcome, but they can't be overcome all at once. You can't wake up and just say, okay, everybody's equal and everything they do, that's it. Why not? Well, because some kinds of work, for example, takes more development, more education, more training to learn how to do than other kinds. It's more specialized. And so people who do that kind of work, who put in more time and have to go through more education and training to develop the skills and knowledge for that job, have to be paid more as long as you have that division. Not only would it be unfair not to do that, but the bigger problem is you would wreck your society if you didn't do it. Remember what I said earlier about how the foundation of everything that goes on in the world is the exchange of labor among people? Well, if you screw up your exchange of labor, if you have people spending years learning how to do something, and you only pay them the same amount as somebody who doesn't have to spend years doing another job, then the amount of labor that goes into learning how to do that job will be wasted in effect. And your economy will get out of whack. And it'll break down. So that's a problem we're going to face, because if you leave those inequalities alone, we're going to go right back to capitalism. So we have to figure out how to overcome these inequalities step by step, and certain times taking leaps. We have to get to the point where we can bring forward whole new groups of people who can do all these different kind of jobs. But that can't be done just like that in one fell swoop either. Because people have to eat. Because there needs to be medical care. Because there needs to be housing. All those things I talked about, those needs have to be met. And since we're not exploiting other people here around the world to do it, the people themselves have to organize and do that work. And while you're doing that work, you can't be off studying medicine. So it's going to be a while until we break down and overcome these divisions so that everybody can spend part of the day learning many different skills and many different spheres of knowledge, and part of the day working to produce the things that are needed for the basic requirements of people. And we're also, as I said, going to need an army. Imagine if we made a revolution and everything that went into that, and then we said, okay, that's it, time to rest. That's enough struggle and sacrifice. So we'll just put down our arms and just see what happens. Well, we know what will happen. The imperialists and other exploiters and oppressors will crush us in a minute. And all the nightmare we've just struggled to get out of finally will be brought back with a vengeance. So we're going to need an army. An army is a professional body of people whose vocation, what they do is military affairs. They specialize in that. So while they're doing that, they can't do other things. So it's a long-term process to overcome all these inequalities and divisions in society so we can get to the point where everybody can do all these things and finally get to the point where we don't need armies anymore. We also have to get beyond commodities and money. Yes, we're going to get beyond money. You have to do that. Because as long as things are produced as commodities, as long as money is the means of circulating things, then we're going to get all the effects of capitalism, and money can be used to hire people again and exploit them again. But it's going to take a struggle to get beyond money and commodities. In order to do that, you have to be able to produce enough things in enough abundance that they can be distributed among people, not just in one country, but all over the world, without having to use money as a means of measuring how all that's happening. That requires getting to a whole different place where we can produce the things people need in much shorter time and produce them and distribute them all over the world. And when we can do that, we can also free up people not to have to work on doing one thing or another. But they can do many different things. And we can also get beyond a situation where someone has to be given more in exchange for one kind of job as opposed to someone who's given less in exchange for another kind of job, because whatever you do won't be measured in money like a commodity anymore. It'll just be what you do to contribute to society, and you'll get back what you need in order to live and in order to develop. So that's a long-term struggle, full of contradiction, full of problems, in order to get to all that. Again, all this cannot be eliminated all at once, but that has to be the goal, and we have never to lose sight of that goal. We have to keep advancing toward it to the greatest degree we can at any given time once we've made the first great leap of seizing power. Now let me be clear, this doesn't mean that in the future society everyone will be the same or that everyone will have exactly the same things. Everybody will have to use the same toothbrush, like they say sometimes. I'm very confident that we'll have plenty of toothbrushes for everybody. What it means is that people's needs will be met and that the diversity among people will be celebrated as part of the overall unity of the people. But differences, including different needs among people, will not be turned into relations in which one person oppresses another or one part of society or of the world exploits the rest. Until we have moved beyond all these inequalities and beyond money and commodities and everything that still carries the birthmarks of capitalism, until that has been completely and finally left behind all over the world, we will need the dictatorship of the proletariat. This dictatorship is crucial in making it possible to move beyond commodities and money and the great inequalities that capitalism and every other form of society based on exploitation has handed down to the people of the world. This is the great inheritance they will have left us. An inheritance we do not need or want. An inheritance we must refuse and renounce, which we must thoroughly overcome and eliminate. The revolutionary dictatorship of the proletariat is a key instrument for us in accomplishing this. It is the instrument of the proletariat and the masses of people for achieving all this, until finally inequalities and all the scars and wounds from the past have been eliminated, and the needs of all the people will be met in an ever-increasing way. And the idea of some people being inferior or superior to others will no longer have any meaning or any basis. It will be seen as ridiculous, outrageous, and crazy by people everywhere in the world. The basic principle of communism is what is captured in the slogan, from each according to their ability, to each according to their needs. What this means is in a society where you're no longer being exploited by others, and you no longer have to sell your ability to work and your very body in working in order to earn a wage to buy other things. Once we move beyond all that, then people will not think in terms of getting paid and what they're getting out of what they contribute to society. They will contribute what they can in many different ways, and they will increasingly be developing their all-around ability to contribute more in different things. And they will get back from society in turn what they actually need. For example, people may have certain needs in health, let's say, that require them to have something dealing with that health, with that problem, which other people don't have. But this won't be measured in terms of a wage or getting paid or money. It'll just be there from the provision of society. Now, of course, this could never work with the relations we have now and with people carrying over the ideas that they have now. This is why, going back to those four alls, the communist revolution doesn't just change the economic, political, and social relations. It also involves the revolutionizing of the thinking of the people to a whole different way of seeing things. One thing that's very important to understand is that your needs and wants are not something you're born with. They're something that are conditioned by the society you live in, by what you actually need in order to live, and by what they're constantly telling you you need. For example, in this society, we have this ridiculous situation of so many cars clogging up everything and using up so much resources and creating so much pollution. But you can't get by. Hardly can get by without a car in a society. Most parts of the society, there isn't even a subway system, and even if there is, you can't get by without a car. Very hard to get by without. How are you going to get to work? How are you going to do all these different things you have to do? So naturally, people feel they have a need for a car. At the same time, you see a lot of these, you say, I just don't need a car. I need just the right rims for the wheel on my car. Now, where does that come? You don't really need those rims. But this is what you've been propagandized to think that you need. It's what you feel you need in order to make a statement, in order to say something about yourself, in order not to be crushed down, in order to get some respect. But this is socially conditioned. This comes from the conditions you live in and the way you're propagandized about what you need. What we really need and what we'll have in a whole different society is not this crazy situation where it's so ridiculous that if you think about it, the carpool lane means you have two people in your car. I mean, that's perfectly ridiculous. We'll have a whole situation where throughout the society and all over the world, people will develop other systems of mass transportation that people can move around in. And besides that, people won't feel like they want to be shut up in their little cars, getting into their road rage, ready to pull out their strap and shoot somebody else for cutting them off in a lane. Because you're going to have a whole different society. People are going to see things a whole different way. whole different needs. So we'll have a mass transportation system that meets the needs of the people and also enables them to socialize more. People were telling me about the blackout in New York recently, how people did a lot more socializing and having fun with each other than they ever did in years before that. Because the way in which the society atomizes people, divides everybody off and puts them in their own little pockets, got broken down for a little while. Well, we'll break that down completely so people, yes, they can have... Yes, they can have privacy when they want it. There should be provision for that. People ought to be able to go off by themselves and think by themselves what they want, or just a couple of friends hang out and do what they want to do for a while. We shouldn't make a law out of it. It shouldn't be the way the whole society is organized. People ought to be able to socialize and learn from each other and have fun with each other. Learn new things from other people all the time. Why not? And then, at the same time as we have mass transportation, we can have a few vehicles, I don't know what kind they'll be, but for people to use for recreation. They want to drive to the mountains or along the ocean to see something. A bunch of friends can do that. These things are not hard to solve once we remove the obstacle of capitalism out of the way. They're complicated, but they're complications we can handle. But again, to get to communism, we need the dictatorship of the proletariat. The dictatorship of the proletariat is not about a small number exploiting the great majority. And it is not about creating new exploiters from among the ranks of the people who used to be the oppressed part of society. It is not about making them suffer like we suffered. The overthrown exploiters and oppressors, and those who were shown beyond doubt to be determined to bring back the system of exploitation and oppression, they must be and they will be put down and kept down so that the masses of people can finally stand up. And so that standing up, they can go on to revolutionize and transform things from the bottom up. Now, of course, those who have committed towering and horrible crimes against the people, crimes against humanity, they must be punished for these crimes, and they will be. But the purpose and goal of revolution is not revenge. And if revenge becomes what motivates people, this will take the whole revolution off course and we'll end up back where we were before. In thinking about this, I went back to the movie Spartacus. It's about a slave rebellion in the ancient Roman Empire. In particular, these are slaves who were forced to be gladiators, trained to fight to the death in the arenas for the entertainment and enjoyment of the Roman empires and the Roman aristocracy, the Roman ruling class, and even for the populace, to drag the populace down too. And finally, these slaves were tired of being trained to be gladiators. They rose up, they broke out of their conditions of enslavement. They went to other slaves and they formed step by step and in a rolling kind of way a growing army of slaves fighting back against the Roman army. And eventually, in history, in fact, they were crushed and defeated. And that's shown in the movie. But still, there are many lessons to learn from that. One that I was thinking of particularly when I was trying to figure out about this question of revenge and how to understand it and how to explain it. There's this scene in the movie Spartacus where at a certain point they go back to the old training center where they were trained to be gladiators. And some of the former slaves drag out some of the people who forced them to train this way and give them the weapons of death and set them to fighting each other while they sit around and laugh and enjoy the spectacle. And after a certain point, Spartacus steps in and he says, no, this is not what this is about. Yes, we have to fight the Roman Empire. We have to defeat them if we can. But we're doing that to get freed. We're doing it to get out of slavery. We're not doing it so we can drag down other people and drag ourselves down in the process into this degraded condition. There's a difference between just and necessary punishment and revenge. We have to have our sights much higher than revenge. We have to have our sights on a whole new world. The dictatorship of the proletariat in this new society is not about, now I get my chance to fuck over other people. This revolution is about liberation. It's about emancipation. It's about transforming, radically changing the foundations of society and all its relations and institutions and ways of thinking, to bring about real and complete liberation, to end a situation where anyone is ruling over anyone else, where one part of society of the world is dominating and exploiting the rest, to bring into being a radically different world, to bring into being cooperative and collective ways of doing things for the benefit of humanity, and to continually expand the freedom, the creativity, and the initiative of individuals within that overall cooperative and collective framework. For all these reasons, the fundamental aim of a dictatorship of the proletariat is not to keep power for the proletariat and its vanguard party. The aim is to keep the revolution going forward until communism has been reached worldwide, and there is no longer any need for the dictatorship of the proletariat or for a vanguard party. No longer any need, because the conditions will have been brought into being all over the world where any difference between thinkers and doers will have been eliminated, because people generally will be both thinkers and doers, where the difference between leaders and followers and between power holders and people over whom power is held, all this will have been eliminated and moved beyond. And there will finally be a true global community without inequality between nationalities and between men and women, without barriers of class and of nation, a world community of people freely associating, cooperating, and working and struggling with each other to continue knowing and changing the world in the interest not of this or that small clique of exploiters, but of humanity as a whole. This revolution requires a broad vision, a lofty and sweeping viewpoint. The goal is to get to where everyone can have this vision, this viewpoint, and can apply it together with others to keep on knowing and changing the world. To get there, we need leadership that has taken up this vision and viewpoint and this scientific outlook and method for knowing and changing the world. To get there, just as we need the dictatorship of the proletariat, we need the leadership of a communist vanguard party. Next, before the next break, I want to talk a little bit about carrying forward the revolution, overcoming the obstacles, and winning a whole new world. As much as socialism will bring about all these great changes to serve the people and the revolutionary struggle throughout the world, as much as socialism and the rule of the proletariat opens the way to the goal of a communist world, it is only the transition, that is, the road to that world, and not yet that communist world itself. Challenges will remain. Problems and contradictions will have to be solved in order to make the truly historic advance to communism. As I spoke to earlier, a big challenge in keeping the revolution going forward in socialist society toward the goal of communism will be to overcome the inequalities and other wounds and scars left over from the old society, the inheritance from capitalism and thousands of years of oppressive relations and the chains and dead weight of tradition. And there is the fact that revolutions cannot be made all at the same time in every country all over the world, but instead are generally made one or a few at a time. And because of this, for some time to come, where the proletariat comes to power and establishes its rule and embarks on the socialist road, there will be the challenge not only of overcoming great inequalities within that country, but also of having to deal with the remaining imperialist powers and those allied with them who will continue to threaten and may even outright attack the new socialist states. A major part of this challenge will be to defend the socialist country that's brought into being while continuing the revolution within that country and actively supporting and assisting revolutionary struggles throughout the world. To meet this challenge will mean, and it will require defeating the threats and attacks by the imperialists and their allies as long as they remain in the world. But the real challenge, the even greater challenge, will be doing this by means and methods that don't fall back into the ways of the old system itself, and doing it instead by means and methods that serve the advance beyond all that. One key part of this will be having a professional armed force that, together with the masses of people as a whole, is capable of fighting and defeating the imperialists without turning this army into one that is like the military of the imperialists themselves, an army that demands blind obedience from its soldiers, an army that not only stands apart from but comes to stand over the people, an army that is controlled by those who want to stop and reverse the revolution rather than moving it forward. The army of revolution, the army of a socialist state, must be built as, and there must be struggle to continue to develop it as, an army whose members, officers and soldiers together, discuss and debate what their purpose is as an army, why and how they must fight in a conscious way to defend and advance the revolution, why and how they must be closely linked with the masses of people throughout society, and why and how they must play a key part in creating and defending the conditions in which the masses of people can be free to rule and to revolutionize society, and free to do all the things that make that possible, including debating and dissenting from official policy and protesting the actions of the government and government officials. An army that does not do that is not, or is no longer, a revolutionary army. To build and maintain and develop a revolutionary army like this, and to prevent it from being turned into an army of oppression against the people, will obviously take a lot of struggle. It will be one key part of the overall struggle that will be necessary to continue advancing toward communism, toward the time when armies of any kind will no longer be necessary and will no longer exist. From all this, we can see even more clearly how socialism, even with all the imagining we have done, which is really drawn from our historical experience, even with all the ways in which socialism is itself a radically different and far better society than capitalism, we can see how it is still only a transition to communism and not yet communism itself. We can get a fuller sense of the great challenges we will face and which we will have to meet and deal with, not just in overthrowing this system at long last and establishing socialism, but in continuing to go forward through socialism to the goal of a communist world. We can see the reasons why, even with their tremendous achievements, the first attempts of the proletariat to maintain socialism and continue advancing toward communism were defeated, first in the Soviet Union and then in China. And we can see the need to learn as deeply as possible from this. But despite these setbacks and defeats, through all the many different pathways that human beings and their societies have taken throughout history, and with all the suffering that exploiters and oppressors have imposed on the great mass of humanity for thousands of years, with all the bullshit people have been dragged into and caught up in, with all that, the foundation has been laid for a whole radically different world. This capitalist system has brought into being the basis for this revolutionary leap for humanity. Capitalism, especially in its imperialist stage, has bound people closer together all over the world. We should recognize that there are two sides to the increasing globalization that is being brought about under the domination of imperialism in the world today. On the one side, this is spreading and deepening exploitation throughout the world. This is bringing about even greater agony and oppression in most parts of the world. It is uprooting huge numbers of people and forcing them to move from one place to another, and particularly from the countryside to the city, within one country and from one country to another all over the world. But despite all this, on the other side, it is making closer and more powerful the ties between exploited and oppressed people all over the world. And you can see this in the anti-globalization demonstrations, for example. Increasingly, they gather together thousands of people from many different parts of the world. I was just reading about this in our newspaper, an article about what went on in Cancun. People from Korea and Mexico and the United States and many other parts of the world. And this has been true more and more of the anti-globalization demonstrations. This heightened globalization is creating new problems that have to be faced and overcome, such as the ways in which the imperialists are able to react more quickly and forcibly to events everywhere in the world, including protests and uprisings and revolutionary struggles, which the imperialists will move to attack. But all this is also creating the basis for more people in every part of the world to become more informed more quickly about things and to act in support of protests and rebellions and revolutionary struggles and revolutionary wars wherever they are taking place. And most fundamentally, capitalism has brought forward the proletariat, the class whose exploitation is the basis for capitalism. Capitalism cannot do without the proletariat, but the proletariat can do very well without capitalism. Capitalism cannot do without exploiting the proletariat as the very foundation of this system. But the proletariat is a class which, as a whole, as a class of exploited people, has no interest in exploitation and oppression, and has a great need to get rid of all this in order to liberate itself. And once again, this is why the proletariat is the force which all over the world can lead the masses of people to overthrow this system that exploits and oppresses them, and to bring a new world, a communist world, into being. This is the historic era we are living in now. The era when capitalism can be brought down. When, along with every other form of society in which one part dominates and exploits others, this can be done away with. And then symbols and records of this kind of society can be put into the museum of history, where people in the future will look at this and wonder and find it hard to believe that such things ever existed. The capitalists, the modern-day imperialists, do have great power, and they do have the ability to bring down tremendous destruction. There's no way we can be serious about making revolution without facing this. They do have all this, including nuclear weapons, or nuclear weapons, as George W. Bush insists on saying it. Listen to that. Listen to him speak. Nuclear. The word is nuclear, motherfucker. It comes from the fact that it has to do with changes in the nucleus, the inner core of the atom. This is not just a mistake Bush is making in saying it the wrong way, saying nuclear instead of nuclear. He may be a stupid fool, but he has always enjoyed great privilege. Every opportunity has been given to him, including in terms of education. He has supposedly studied at elite schools like Yale. And he has advisors with elite educations to tell him how to pronounce this word if somehow he really didn't know. He and his advisors are deliberately insisting on saying it this way, nuclear, maybe to get across this point. You don't have to be too smart to rule the world. You don't have to know a lot to push the nuclear button, especially if God's on your side. Well, ignorant-ass monsters like W do prove that it's not the best and the brightest who rule in a society like this. It is those who have used the most brutal and ruthless methods to monopolize wealth and power and the means of accumulating wealth and exercising power. And so, once again, W is a very good choice to represent for that class of people. But their power rests on a rotting foundation of exploitation and oppression. They are so extreme in the horrors they bring down because imperialism is the final stage of their system. Because their system is straining against its own limits, its own basic contradictions. But it cannot overcome them. This system cannot turn itself into something different. It cannot be other than what it is. Of course, the capitalists do not and cannot recognize this. They do not see that their system is outdated and is over from an historical standpoint. But even if they could somehow get a glimpse of this, they could not change their system even if they wanted to. This is a vampire system. It literally lives off the blood and off the bones of the great mass of humanity. And it could not keep going any other way. Now let me say it again. Let's be serious here. We do have to face the great challenge of defeating these capitalist imperialists with all their power, their machinery of mass destruction and murder, and preventing them from destroying the world and the future of humanity is also part of the challenge we have to take up, the revolutionary struggle we have to wage. In all this, we can and we must rely on the one thing we can rely on the much greater potential power of the masses of people, the millions and billions who suffer daily outrages and horrors under this system, the masses of people who, as Mao Zedong poetically put it, have potentially unlimited, inexhaustible enthusiasm for this communist revolution and tremendous creative energy in carrying out this revolution as they become conscious of the necessity and the possibility of this revolution and the new world it will bring into being. As this understanding is brought to them and they are unleashed with this understanding by their vanguard leadership. By combining the deeply felt hopes and aspirations of the masses of people for a different and better world, and their resistance to the outrages of this system, by combining that with the scientific understanding of society that the vanguard brings, and by relying on this powerful combination, we can develop the means to finally engage and defeat the imperialists, to shatter, dismantle, and crush their machinery of oppression, repression, death, and destruction. The proletariat, at the head of all oppressed people, can bring about a revolutionary change, even in the face of, and by daring to advance through, the many horrors and great destruction this capitalist imperialist system will perpetrate because of its very nature, and it will perpetrate it whether we stand up and fight against them or not. The difference is, if we stand up and fight against them, we can sweep this away in the end. In this struggle, the people in any one place or in any one country are not alone. As I spoke to earlier, the proletariat is an international class. The billions of exploited and oppressed people the world over are bound even more closely together than ever before, even while those who rule over us constantly work to divide and conquer us. The revolutionary struggle for communism is fundamentally and above all a worldwide struggle, and this gives it great strength. Think of the ridiculous situation that we have in the world, where it's divided up the way it is. For example, in the region of the world where we just had the war on Iraq, Turkey, north of Iraq, has a dam that is put up on the Euphrates River. And this is causing great harm and problems for the countries of Iraq and Syria. This conflict over the water between these neighboring countries over a river that flows through all of them, and yet one country puts up a dam and diverts it in a certain way. Instead of all the people of these countries being able to get together and figure out what's the best way to make use of this to serve the people and not to destroy their interests. And we even have this kind of conflict within this country itself. Different rivers that are contended over by different states and different interests, trying to divert it one way or another for the particular interest of this or that group, usually this or that group of capitalists. All this calls to mind and brings out very sharply the statement by Marx about how in the future society, in the world of communism, the idea of different people owning parts of the earth will seem as absurd as it does today for one person to own another. This is why our revolution is an international revolution. In order to reach the final goal of communism, the revolutionary proletariat and its vanguard in every country must apply the principle of proletarian internationalism. This means it must proceed first and above all from the standpoint of how to advance the whole revolutionary cause internationally, worldwide. The struggle for revolution in any particular country, as important as that is, must always be developed as part of that overall worldwide revolution. Wherever the proletariat, together with its allies, succeeds in making revolution and coming to power, it must not only defend what it has won, and it must not only continue the revolution to completely transform that particular country, it must above all develop its new socialist country as a base area for the whole worldwide revolution, as not only a model and a shining light, but also a source of concrete support for the revolutionary struggle throughout the world. Today, the most important organized expression of proletarian internationalism is the Revolutionary Internationalist Movement, the RIM, which unites Maoist parties and organizations from many crucial and strategic parts of the world, including Nepal and India, Iran and Turkey, Peru and other places in Latin America. Our party recognizes the great importance of the RIM. We have been a part of the RIM since its founding in the mid-1980s, and we gladly and enthusiastically take up the responsibility of contributing the most we can to the development and strengthening of the RIM. And let me say something here very clearly. With all the seriousness that this involves, we are very aware that these monsters who rule over us and seek to rule the whole world will try to make us pay a very heavy price for our internationalism. Let's make no mistake about that. They declare that only they, once again, have the right to use force and violence in the world, and that no one has the right to use force and violence to stand up against oppression and to make revolution. They try to label and brand anyone who rises up in revolution, regardless of whether they mobilize masses of people and have the backing of the great majority of people or not. They try to brand them all as terrorists. They try to say they had George Washington and those other slave owners who made a revolution, and that's the end of revolution. No, that's the end of the bourgeois revolution, and the time is coming for the end of the bourgeoisie. They want to say that because they have all these arsenals of mass destruction, slaughter, and murder, that they can say whatever they want and everybody has to obey. They can tell all the lies they want and everybody has to believe them or at least accept them. That everybody has to shut up and go along with what they say. Well, we do not believe their lies. We do not accept what they say. And we will not shut up and we will not go along. Look at the situation in Nepal. There was a very interesting article in the New York Times, a little blurb a couple of days ago. It's very interesting how the media, the mainstream media, constructs things. I always had this idea that we should have some kind of a TV program called Uncle Freddie Engages the Bourgeois Press. But anyway, that's a subject for another time, how to expose all the bullshit and how they construct their bullshit. But this was very illustrative, very interesting, this article in the New York Times. It was an article talking about a general strike that had taken part in Nepal. It was called by the Maoist Communist Party of Nepal. But what did they emphasize in this thing was some violence that occurred. A few people that were killed, supposedly the way they characterized it by the Maoists killing them. And they tried to make it sound like just ordinary civilians, ordinary people. Tried to make it sound, in other words, like an act of terrorism. But buried in this article in the middle of a sentence was, these acts occurred in a general strike which shut down the kingdom. Now think about that. The whole country is shut down by a general strike called by the Maoists, who don't have military control in the whole country, especially in Kathmandu, the capital, and other places. If the whole country is shut down by a general strike, what's that tell you about the support of the people and where it lies and what this revolution is all about? If they want to say that this is terrorism, then there's no meaning to terrorism, except what they do. Here is a struggle that clearly has the support of the overwhelming majority of people who stood up in the ways that I've been talking about earlier. Yet they want to brand that as terrorism, and they want to say that our party and others who stand up and support this revolutionary struggle and build support for it are terrorists or supporters of terrorists. And they will come after us for this, and we know it. But we must have a clear orientation that we will defeat their attempts to crush and defeat the revolution in Nepal. And we must have an orientation that we will defeat their attempts to crush our party for taking its internationalist stand, taking its internationalist responsibilities, and supporting the people all over the world who for centuries have suffered under unspeakable oppression and who finally are breaking through here and there to rise up and to get rid of all of this. And we will never stop supporting them in doing so. We're not fools. We're not going to make it easy for them to attack us. Our support is political for this revolutionary struggle. We build political support for it. We're not trying to run other people's revolutions. But we are going to carry out our internationalist responsibilities and our internationalist unity with them. We're not going to make it easy for them to attack us in this, but we know they're going to do it anyway. And we have to be prepared for this, and we have to take it seriously. And we have to go to the masses of people with this and show them where their real interests lie in all this and mobilize them on that basis. In this time, there are people's wars and revolutionary armed struggles in a number of countries in the Third World. And there is powerful resistance to capitalist globalization and imperialist war throughout the world. A new development which holds important potential is the recent founding of the World People's Resistance Movement under the leadership of the RIM. This is a broader united front led by the RIM that is beginning its activities now mainly in Europe and South Asia. And the aim is to develop it into a vehicle for mobilizing broad numbers of people and a broad range of forces in many parts of the world in the fight against imperialism and in support of revolution. The RIM is a very important beginning, a very important regrouping and uniting of Maoist forces in key parts of the world after the defeat of the revolution and the destruction of socialism in China following the death of Mao Zedong in 1976. Through the storms and battles that lie ahead, especially in the face of the juggernaut of the U.S. imperialists, there is an importance and urgency, and there is definite potential to build and strengthen Maoist parties united in the RIM and to greatly strengthen the RIM itself. And the RIM has the longer-term goal of bringing into being an even stronger international communist organization, united on an even higher level, able even more fully and powerfully to assist the revolution in particular countries and to advance things overall toward the final aim of communism worldwide. The very nature and the very workings of the capitalist imperialist system will continue not only to oppress and exploit and even to drag down the proletariat and the masses of people, but it will also force them to rise up in resistance to this. It will continue to call forth the forces that can finally put an end to this monstrous system. As Mao Zedong so powerfully put it, where there is oppression, there will be resistance. And we've seen this time and time again. And resistance can be developed. It can be led to become revolution, to overthrow and bury forever this system and all the madness and misery it causes. The need for this revolution will keep on pushing itself forward, time and again, through all the dead weight of the capitalist system, through all the horrors and destruction it keeps bringing down in its effort to keep itself going and on top, through all the roadblocks and obstacles it puts in the way of the advance of humanity. Through all this, and even where we are defeated and have to fall back and regroup, even when, here or there, vanguard forces leading the proletariat are temporarily crushed or go off the path into the swamp, through all this, there is an ever-growing body of knowledge and a scientific viewpoint and method that can reveal the fundamental truths about this system and the need and possibility of overthrowing it and bringing a radically different and better world into being. Even if, and even where great setbacks are suffered, there will continually be people who will go back to these fundamental truths, and they will once again unite to form the leading force, the vanguard of this revolution, and will go out to lead the proletariat and masses of people to fight to bring down this monstrous system and bring a whole new world into being, building on past achievements while learning from past mistakes and defeats. As I have said before, this system is doomed. Let's do our part to finish it off and bring something far better into being. Next, and in the final part, I'm going to be getting deeper into some challenges and problems we have to face and overcome, which I've only touched on so far. I'll be returning to some key questions about the revolutionary path I've laid out, and in particular, and first of all, the big question: how could we actually make revolution in a country like the U.S.? But first, a break for intermission.